In the autumn of 1942, the United States of America had been at war for less than a year, and it was about to send young men who had never heard a shot fired in anger onto the beaches of a continent most of them couldn't have found on a map 6 months earlier. That is where this story begins. Not with a great general standing on a hilltop, not with a prime minister's famous speech. It begins with ordinary men. A 22-year-old from rural Georgia, a factory worker's son from Cleveland, a sheep farmer from New Zealand, a Gurkha rifleman from the hills of Nepal, an Algerian tirailleur who had been a colonial subject his entire life. All of them set in motion by forces larger than any single one of them, pointed at a desert they didn't know, toward an enemy they hadn't met yet, inside a plan that the men who designed it weren't entirely confident would work. That is the honest starting point for the North African campaign. Not triumph, not destiny, uncertainty, and ordinary people walking into it anyway. I want to tell you something about what this documentary is before you settle in. I've spent a considerable amount of time, more than I originally planned, which is how it always goes, in the primary sources of this campaign, after action reports from American regimental headquarters in Tunisia, intelligence assessments from Eisenhower's headquarters at Algiers, operational diaries of British armoured brigades that spent the winter of 1942 to 43 moving through mud that turned the roads to paste and the planning timelines to fiction, the private letters of soldiers who wrote home and said, with the careful self-censorship of men who knew their mail was read, that things were a bit difficult, when what they meant was that they were afraid, and the man in the next foxhole hadn't come back from the patrol. I've read those letters. I've read the memoirs of generals who, decades later, were still arguing about who made the right call at Kasserine. I've read the Axis side, the German quartermaster records showing fuel reserves dropping week by week, the Italian Navy's convoy logs documenting ships that left port and didn't arrive. And I can tell you, with the confidence of someone who has spent a long time in this specific material, that the North African campaign is one of the most complex, most consequential, and most misunderstood campaigns of the entire Second World War. Most misunderstood. I want to stay with that for a moment because it shapes everything that follows. The popular understanding of the North African campaign, if it has one at all, tends to compress into a few images. Rommel in his peaked cap and goggles, the legendary desert fox outwitting his opponents across the sand, Montgomery at El Alamein, methodical and undefeatable, American troops getting beaten at a place called Kasserine, and then somehow turning it around. These images aren't wrong, exactly. They're just incomplete in ways that matter. Rommel was brilliant and overextended and defeated by forces he couldn't control. Montgomery was methodical and right, and also, sometimes, frustratingly slow in ways his contemporaries complained about, and historians still debate. The Americans at Kasserine were badly led, institutionally unprepared, and tactically outmatched, and within 3 months had become, by measurable operational standards, a genuinely formidable fighting force. The campaign contained all of those things simultaneously, and understanding it means holding the complexity, rather than flattening it into a story with a single lesson. Here is what the North African campaign actually was, stripped of its mythology and put plainly. It was the place where the Allied coalition learned to fight, not in the abstract, not in training, in the field against a skilled enemy, in conditions that punished every mistake and rewarded nothing but competence, discipline, and the willingness to change when the evidence showed you were wrong. The American army that came ashore in Morocco in November of 1942 was not the army that broke through the German lines at Tunis in May of 1943. The difference between those two armies, in combined arms coordination, in logistics management, in air-ground integration, in the quality of its junior leadership, is one of the most significant institutional transformations in the history of the United States military. It happened in 6 months. It happened in Africa. And it happened because the alternative to learning was dying. The British, too, were changed by this campaign, though in different ways. The Eighth Army that fought El Alamein wasn't the same force that had been driven back to the Egyptian border in the summer of 1942. Montgomery had reorganized it, re-equipped it, and this is the word the veterans use repeatedly in their accounts. Believed in it, in a way that the succession of commanders before him had not managed with sufficient consistency. The Second Battle of El Alamein was the first major British land victory against Germany in the entire war. For a nation that had been fighting since September of 1939, 3.5 years, and had accumulated a long catalogue of evacuation, retreat, and costly failure, the meaning of that victory was not merely operational, it was psychological. It was the moment when a country that had been enduring started to believe it might be winning, Churchill said, with unusual restraint for a man not known for understatement, that it was not the end, not even the beginning of the end, but perhaps the end of the beginning. He was right, and it is worth sitting with that for a moment. The beginning ending in the Egyptian desert, in October and November of 1942, with the guns of 900 artillery pieces lighting the horizon from end to end. I want to be transparent with you about one thing before we go further, because I think it matters for how you listen to what follows. I've tried, throughout this documentary, to be scrupulous about the distinction between what is documented and what is inferred. Military history is full of confident assertions about why commanders made the decisions they made, what soldiers were feeling at specific moments, what the atmosphere was in a headquarters on a particular evening. Some of those assertions are grounded in primary sources, memoirs, letters, official records, signals traffic that has been declassified. Some of them are reconstructions, working backward from outcome to intention. I've tried to be clear about which is which. When I say that Eisenhower was anxious about his command in the weeks before Torch, I say it because his correspondence from that period shows it. When I say that the men on the transport ships crossing the Atlantic in October of 1942 were uncertain about what awaited them, I say it because that's what the accounts of those men, written afterward, consistently describe. I haven't invented dialogue. I haven't assigned thoughts to historical figures that I can't source. What you'll hear in this documentary is the campaign as the evidence shows it, which is, if anything, more interesting than the mythology, because it was made by real people operating under real constraints rather than by the heroes and villains that popular history prefers. Now, the geography. Because you can't understand this campaign without understanding where it was fought. And the geography of North Africa in the Second World War was not simply background. It was an active participant in the fighting. The North African theatre of the Second World War stretched, at its widest extent, from the Moroccan Atlantic coast in the west to the Egyptian Nile Delta in the east, a distance of more than 4,000 kilometers along the Mediterranean coast. The fighting, at any given moment, occupied a much smaller portion of that distance. But the logistics of supplying armies across those distances shaped every operational decision made by every commander in the theatre. The coastal road, the Via Balbia in the Libyan stretch, built by Mussolini's colonial administration in the 1930s, was the single thread along which the mobile war moved back and forth. Inland, though terrain varied from the utterly flat and featureless gravel plains of the Egyptian Western Desert, where armies could maneuver freely in any direction, to the folded, complex mountains of Tunisia, where the passes and ridges turned mobile warfare into something much closer to the fixed positional fighting of the First World War. The soldiers who fought in both kinds of terrain, and many did, moving from the desert to the Tunisian mountains as the campaign progressed, found them almost incomparably different in their tactical demands. The desert was open and fast and logistically brutal. The mountains were close and slow and physically punishing in a different way entirely. The climate was as variable as the terrain. The western desert in summer was genuinely oppressively hot. Daytime temperatures reaching over 40 degrees Celsius in the shade, and there was rarely shade. The same desert in winter was cold enough for frost at night. Tunisia in November and December of 1942 was wet in a way that the Allied planners, some of whom had planned for a desert campaign, hadn't adequately modelled. The winter rains turned the Tunisian plains to thick clay mud that immobilized vehicles, closed airfields, and turned supply roads into obstacle courses. The soldiers on both sides learned the climate, the same way they learned everything else in this campaign, by being in it when it happened to them. And then there was the sand. This sounds banal, and I apologize for it, but the sand of the Western Desert was a genuinely significant operational factor in ways that the operational histories mention and then proceed past too quickly. Fine sand infiltrated every mechanical system: vehicle engines, rifle actions, artillery breech mechanisms, radio equipment. Maintenance demands in the desert were higher than in any other theatre. Units that fell behind on vehicle maintenance saw their mobility degrade. Units whose mechanical discipline was poor found themselves immobilized at critical moments. The Desert Air Force developed specific maintenance protocols for aircraft engines operating in sand that had no equivalent elsewhere. The Germans developed the Feifel air filter system for their tanks. The Americans learned about sand filters the hard way. All of this is in the records, and all of it matters to understanding why the campaign unfolded the way it did. I've been talking for a while now, and I want to acknowledge something. This is a long documentary, 15 chapters, several hours of narration. If you're here for a quick summary, this isn't it. But if you're here because you want to understand this campaign, really understand it in the way that requires sitting with complexity and following arguments through to their conclusions, then I think you're in the right place. The North African campaign deserves this kind of attention, and I've tried to give it that. Every chapter is grounded in the operational record. Every claim is sourced in something documentable. The arguments and debates I'll present are real arguments between real historians, not fabricated controversy, and the human texture, the soldier-level experience, the letters home, the accounts of men who were there and wrote about it afterward, is drawn from primary sources, not constructed for atmosphere. There is one more thing I want to say before we begin Chapter 1, and it's something I feel strongly enough about to say directly rather than work it in sideways. The men who fought in North Africa, on all sides, in all the formations, under all the flags, were not abstract historical actors. They were people. They had preferences and fears and habits and families. They had opinions about their officers, sometimes unprintable ones. They got homesick. They got sick in the ordinary way, as well as the combat way. They formed friendships under pressure that lasted the rest of their lives. And they lost friends under pressure, in ways that some of them never fully recovered from. The history of this campaign is, at its deepest level, a history of what those people did and what was done to them. And I've tried throughout to keep that in view, even when the operational detail requires a close focus on movements and dates and command decisions that can make the history feel abstract and bloodless. It isn't abstract. It never was. The Sanders covered most of the physical evidence. The veterans, the youngest of whom would be in their late 90s today, are almost all gone. What remains is the record, the documents, the accounts, the analysis, the archaeology of the campaign that the historians and archivists have been building for more than 80 years. This documentary is my attempt to do justice to some part of that record and to the people whose lives are in it. If you're watching this for the first time, welcome. Please subscribe to the channel and turn on the bell notification, because this series runs to 15 full chapters, and I'll be releasing the remainder over the coming weeks. If you've already watched some chapters and you're returning, thank you. It means more than the algorithm will tell you. Share this video with someone who you think would sit still long enough for it. The history deserves an audience that's willing to pay attention. And now, November of 1942, 850 ships, 107,000 men, an ocean in the dark. Let's begin. Chapter 1. The problem nobody wanted to solve. There's a temptation, when you approach the origins of Operation Torch, to treat the decision to invade North Africa as if it were inevitable, as if Roosevelt and Churchill looked at a map, pointed to Algeria, and agreed in about 5 minutes. The historiographical reality is considerably messier than that. The argument over where and when to strike Germany directly consumed the better part of 1942, and the men doing the arguing were not men who agreed easily on anything. I find myself returning to this period of strategic debate more than almost any other in the entire war, because the disagreements weren't simply about tactics. They were about fundamentally different theories of how Germany could be beaten. The Americans, as a general position in early 1942, wanted to go straight at it. The logic was blunt and in some respects admirable for its directness. Germany was the principal enemy. Germany sat across the English Channel. The most efficient path to defeating Germany was a cross-channel invasion of France, and it ought to happen as soon as possible. General George Marshall, the Army Chief of Staff, held this view with considerable conviction. His planning staff developed proposals under names like Operation Sledgehammer, a limited landing in 1942, and Operation Roundup, the fuller cross-channel assault planned for 1943. The British looked at these plans and saw not ambition but catastrophe. Churchill and his chiefs argued that American forces weren't ready, that the amphibious capability didn't yet exist, and that a premature landing in France would be crushed before it established any meaningful foothold. They weren't wrong about any of that. They were, however, also guided by something the Americans sometimes suspected, but rarely said aloud. A deep strategic caution born from the losses of the First World War and the disasters of 1940. The compromise, and it was absolutely a compromise, not a consensus, was North Africa. The formal name assigned to the planning was Operation Gymnast, later renamed Torch. The idea was that an Anglo-American force would land on the Atlantic and Mediterranean coasts of French North Africa, controlled at this point by the Vichy French government, and push east toward Tunisia. Meanwhile, the British Eighth Army, which had been fighting in the Western Desert since 1940, would push west after the enemy. The Axis forces in between, primarily the German-Italian Panzer Army Africa under Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, would be squeezed from both directions. It was a sensible concept. It was also dependent on a number of moving parts, any one of which could have collapsed the entire enterprise. Command was given to a 51-year-old American general who had never commanded troops in combat. His name was Dwight David Eisenhower. And in the autumn of 1942, more than a few senior British officers privately doubted he was ready for what was being asked of him. I want to spend a moment on this, because the question of Eisenhower's qualifications is one that historians have revisited repeatedly, and the debate hasn't entirely closed. What is documented is that Eisenhower himself was aware of the doubts surrounding him. In his own correspondence from this period, He expressed anxiety about the weight of the operation and its political dimensions. He wasn't commanding a purely military enterprise. He was commanding a coalition, Americans and British, who had different doctrines, different command cultures, and in some cases, a long institutional history of mutual professional condescension. Managing that coalition required skills that weren't in any field manual. Eisenhower had them. It took time for others to see that. The scale of what was planned was, by 1942 standards, staggering. The operation required a fleet of roughly 850 ships, warships and transports combined, carrying approximately 107,000 troops across either the Atlantic Ocean or the length of the Mediterranean in November, against an enemy of uncertain disposition and a nominal ally of entirely uncertain loyalty. The Vichy French forces in North Africa numbered somewhere in the region of 120,000 men. Nobody in London or Washington was certain whether those men would fight, welcome the Allies, or do something unpredictable in between. 3 task forces were designated. The Western Task Force, entirely American, would cross the Atlantic and land on the Moroccan coast near Casablanca. The Center Task Force would land near Oran in Algeria. The Eastern Task Force would land near Algiers. The 2 outer landings were separated by more than 1,000 kilometers of coastline, coordinating them from a command ship in the middle of the Mediterranean, without reliable communications, in the dark, against an unknown level of resistance. It was the kind of problem that military planners usually call complex, and everybody else calls terrifying. There was one more variable that made the whole plan strange, and which the history books sometimes gloss over too quickly: the intelligence dimension. American agents, operating through a network called, in the records, the 12 Apostles, though the exact organizational details remained debated, had been working inside French North Africa for months ahead of the landings. They were making contact with anti-Vichy French officers who might be willing to facilitate a coup on the night of the landings, creating confusion that would reduce resistance. One of the key figures in this effort was General Charles Emmanuel Mast, a French officer in Algiers who was in contact with the Allies. Just weeks before the landings, a clandestine meeting took place at a farmhouse at Cherchell, on the Algerian coast, between Allied representatives and Mast's group. American General Mark Clark was lowered by submarine and brought ashore by small boat for the meeting. That meeting, its details now well documented in American archives, is one of those moments in operational history that sounds so implausible it reads like fiction. A senior American general landed from a submarine, sitting in a farmhouse outside Algiers, discussing the overthrow of a colonial administration. This was the world that produced Operation Torch. By the end of October 1942, the fleets were assembling. The Western Task Force had already departed Hampton Roads in Virginia on the 23rd of October, crossing an ocean in total radio silence, evading German submarine patrols that had made the Atlantic a killing ground for Allied shipping throughout the previous year. The Center and Eastern Task Forces were moving through the Strait of Gibraltar. German intelligence had noted the convoys, but hadn't correctly assessed their destination. The assessments reaching Berlin suggested Greece or Malta as the likely targets. It was one of the more significant intelligence failures of the war. The Axis did not know the blow was coming. The Vichy French command in North Africa knew something was wrong. Ships were appearing, radio traffic was increasing, but didn't act decisively enough to change the outcome. And the men on those ships, thousands of them American soldiers, who'd never been to combat, who'd never seen Africa, who'd never heard a gun fired in anger, they were sitting on transports in the Atlantic, reading paperback novels and playing cards, waiting for a continent. I think often about what those young men knew and didn't know on those ships. Most of them had been in the army less than a year. Many of them had trained in camps in the American South and had shipped out within weeks of completing basic instruction. The army, by its own later assessment, was not ready in November of 1942. Not in terms of combined arms doctrine, not in terms of tank tactics, not in terms of the specific kind of coordination that fighting a modern mechanized enemy required. The British, who'd been fighting since 1940, knew this, though they said it with varying degrees of tact. The Americans knew it too, at some level. There was a reason Marshall had wanted a cross-channel invasion, and Eisenhower had been anxious about the mission. But there was no other option. The operation was committed. The fleets were moving. And on the 8th of November 1942, in the small hours before dawn, the ships hove to off the African coast, and the landing craft went down into the water. The ramps dropped, and a new phase of the war began. Chapter 2. The Shore, the Dark, and the Vichy Question. The 8th of November 1942 is one of those dates that looks clean in retrospect and was chaotic in practice. I've spent a considerable amount of time in primary source accounts from the Moroccan landings specifically, and the word I keep encountering, from American after-action reports, from regimental diaries, from the recollections of individual soldiers, is confusion. Not panic, not catastrophe, but a grinding, pervasive confusion that slowed everything down and turned timetables into fiction within the first 30 minutes of any landing. This is not unusual for amphibious operations. What was unusual about Torch was that the confusion operated on multiple levels simultaneously: tactical, political, and personal, all at once. Take the Western Task Force, landing on the Atlantic coast of Morocco. The beaches near Fedala, roughly 20 kilometers north of Casablanca, were the primary target for the Central Landing Group. The surf on the Atlantic coast of Morocco in November is not a matter to be dismissed. Naval planners had identified a narrow window of acceptable sea conditions, and the conditions on the morning of the 8th were at the outer limits of acceptable. Landing craft broached in the surf. Some capsized. Equipment was lost. Men who'd crossed an ocean in relative safety found themselves struggling in chest-deep water within 50 meters of a beach they were supposed to be securing. The French shore batteries opened fire. Not immediately. There was a pause, a hesitation, that historians have interpreted in different ways. Was it surprise? Was it internal division within the Vichy command? Was it the time required to wake officers and transmit orders? Probably all three, in some proportion. But the batteries did eventually fire, and the warships of the covering force had to respond. And suddenly the Atlantic off the Moroccan coast was producing the kind of naval engagement nobody had planned for. The situation at Oran, in Algeria, was in some ways more organized and in some ways more costly. A direct assault on the harbour, using 2 former American Coast Guard cutters transferred to the Royal Navy, which had been converted for the purpose and loaded with troops intended to seize the port facilities before they could be destroyed, went wrong almost immediately. The vessels, named Walney and Heartland in the operational records, entered the harbour under fire and were overwhelmed. The casualties among the boarding parties were severe, and the attempt to seize the harbour by frontal assault failed. This is one of those moments in the campaign that tends to get compressed in popular histories into a single line, and it deserves more than that. The men on those ships knew the risk. They went in anyway. The French warships at Oran sortied from the harbour and were engaged by the Royal Navy covering force. Most were either sunk or driven aground. The land assault on Oran itself was a more conventional affair, conducted over 2 days, and the city surrendered on the 9th of November. Algiers was different. The coup that Allied agents had been orchestrating for weeks came partly together on the night of the 7th and into the 8th. Anti-Vichy French officers and civilian resistance members seized key points around the city. Telephone exchanges, military headquarters, the radio station. They held the French commander, General Juin, effectively under house arrest for a period. The result was that Allied forces landing near Algiers found substantially less opposition than their counterparts at Oran and Casablanca. Algiers surrendered on the evening of the 8th of November. In operational terms, the Eastern Task Force accomplished its objectives in less than a day. But the political aftermath of Algiers was going to be considerably more complicated than the military success suggested. This is where Admiral Francois Darlan enters the story. And if you've read much about this period, you'll know that Darlan is one of the more uncomfortable figures in the entire Allied war effort. Darlan was the commander-in-chief of all Vichy French forces and a dedicated, documented collaborator with the German occupation regime in France. He happened to be in Algiers when the landings occurred, visiting his ill son, according to accounts of the time. The Allies, and specifically Eisenhower's political advisor Robert Murphy, recognized that Darlan held enormous authority over French forces across North Africa. If he ordered a ceasefire, the fighting would stop. Eisenhower, under enormous pressure to end French resistance as quickly as possible in order to push east toward Tunisia before the Germans could reinforce it, authorized Murphy to negotiate with Darlan. The result was a ceasefire agreement signed on the 11th of November. Darlan ordered all Vichy French forces in North Africa to cease operations. They did. The political reaction in London and Washington was immediate, and in some quarters, furious. Doing a deal with Darlan, a man who had actively facilitated German policies, was seen by many as a moral compromise that tainted the Allied cause. The Free French under de Gaulle were outraged. The press on both sides of the Atlantic ran editorials condemning what they called the Darlan deal. Churchill was deeply uncomfortable. Roosevelt publicly described it as a temporary expedient. Eisenhower, in his own account of the period, argued that the alternative, weeks more of fighting against French forces in North Africa, with all the delays that would entail, was strategically unacceptable. He wasn't wrong. By the cold logic of operational necessity, whether that logic was sufficient to justify the arrangement is a question that historians of the moral dimensions of Allied policy continue to debate. Darlan himself was assassinated in Algiers on Christmas Eve of 1942 by a young French monarchist. The political tangle he represented did not die with him, but its most visible and embarrassing manifestation was removed. Meanwhile, Adolf Hitler's response to the landings was swift in one respect and too slow in another. On the 11th of November, the same day that Darlan's ceasefire came into effect, Hitler ordered the occupation of the previously unoccupied zone of France, eliminating what remained of Vichy sovereignty on the European continent. He also ordered the immediate reinforcement of Tunisia, moving German and Italian units across the narrow strait between Sicily and Tunisia before Allied forces could reach the Tunisian border. This was, from an operational perspective, the correct response. If the Germans could establish a bridgehead in Tunisia strong enough to hold the mountain passes of the eastern Dorsale, they could deny the Allies the quick victory that the entire strategy of Torch depended on. Eisenhower's planners had hoped to reach Tunis within 2 weeks of the Algerian landings. They were going to be disappointed by a significant margin. The Allied race to Tunisia in November of 1942 is a story of logistics, weather, and the geography of North Africa conspiring simultaneously against speed. The British First Army, under Lieutenant General Kenneth Anderson, was pushing east from Algiers along the single coastal road and the narrow rail line that paralleled it. The distances involved were not trivial. From Algiers to Tunis in a straight line is roughly 800 kilometers. The road was not a straight line. The atlas of the North African coast shows that the route passes through mountains, river valleys, and the kind of terrain that slows mechanized columns to the pace of the mud they're moving through. And in November and December of 1942, it rained considerably more than the Allied planners had modelled. Airfields turned to paste, supply trucks struggled, and at the end of all that struggling, there were German troops, fresh, motorized, increasingly organized, holding positions in the Tunisian hills. The Allies came close. In the last days of November, British units reached within roughly 25 kilometers of Tunis. I find this proximity almost painful to read about because you can see in the operational records exactly the moment where the momentum shifted. A German counterattack on the 1st of December pushed the British back from their forward positions. A second attempt in mid-December stalled. By Christmas of 1942, it was clear that the quick campaign the Allies had planned was not going to happen. Tunisia was going to be a long winter's work. Chapter 3. The desert already had a war. Something that gets quietly lost when you focus on Operation Torch is that North Africa wasn't a blank stage when the Allies arrived in November of 1942. The Western Desert had been a war zone since the summer of 1940, and by the time Eisenhower's men were landing at Casablanca, the British Eighth Army had already fought Rommel to a standstill at a place on the Egyptian coast called El Alamein, and then beaten him there decisively in one of the most meticulously planned set-piece battles of the entire war. Understanding the Second Battle of El Alamein isn't optional context for the story of Torch. It's the other jaw of the vice. The two operations, Torch and El Alamein, were designed to function together, and neither makes full sense without the other. By the summer of 1942, the Axis position in North Africa had reached its high water mark. Rommel had driven the Eighth Army back into Egypt, captured the port of Tobruk in June, and was within roughly 100 kilometers of Alexandria. The strategic stakes were, in that moment, genuinely significant. The Suez Canal, the oil of the Middle East, the supply routes to India, all rested on whether the Eighth Army could hold. They held at what became known as the First Battle of El Alamein in July of 1942, though battle somewhat overstates the coherence of what was actually a series of attritional engagements along a defensive line that couldn't be outflanked. To the north was the Mediterranean. To the south was the Qattara Depression, an enormous expanse of salt marsh and escarpment that was impassable to vehicles. For the first time in the Western Desert War, the geography denied Rommel his characteristic ability to go around. He had to go through, and he couldn't. Lieutenant General Bernard Law Montgomery arrived to command the Eighth Army in August of 1942, replacing Claude Auchinleck in a command change that caused significant resentment among some officers who felt Auchinleck had been treated unfairly. Montgomery's personal manner was, by any account, singular. He was confident to a degree that some found inspiring and others found insufferable. He didn't drink. He went to bed early. He believed, firmly and vocally, that armies fought better when their commanders were visible and their plans were clear. What he brought to the Eighth Army in August of 1942 was a set of qualities that the formation, exhausted, bruised, and uncertain, needed badly: confidence, clarity, and a refusal to fight until he was ready. That refusal cost him nothing. Rommel's logistics were struggling. The Mediterranean supply route from Italy was being savaged by the Royal Navy and the RAF, and in the late summer of 1942, the British broke the signal intelligence that told them when the next Rommel offensive was coming. Rommel's last offensive attempt at El Alamein, known as the Battle of Alam Hafa, came at the end of August of 1942 and was essentially anticipated, prepared for, and defeated in detail. Montgomery had positioned his armoured reserve on the ridge of Alam Halfa and declined to let it be drawn into a mobile engagement. Rommel's armoured thrust ran into prepared defences, ran short of fuel, and withdrew. It was the last time the Afrika Korps held the initiative in North Africa. By September, both sides were preparing for the battle they knew was coming. The Axis trying to lay more minefields and consolidate their position, the British building up the enormous material superiority that Montgomery intended to make decisive. The Second Battle of El Alamein began at approximately 20 minutes to 10 in the evening on the 23rd of October, 1942. Montgomery had roughly 195,000 men and more than 1,000 tanks. The Axis had roughly 110,000 men, a significant proportion of them Italian, and fewer than 600 tanks, many of them Italian medium tanks that were markedly inferior in firepower to British armour. The disparity in artillery was even more pronounced. 12 days before Torch, Montgomery opened his offensive with a barrage from more than 900 guns firing simultaneously along a roughly 60-kilometre front. The sound, by accounts of those who heard it, was unlike anything the desert had produced before. Men who were 20 kilometres away described the horizon as lit from end to end. What followed over the next 12 days was not the swift, mobile battle that Rommel had practiced and perfected in his earlier campaigns. Montgomery called the first phase of his offensive break-in, the assault through the deep Axis minefields in the northern sector. Divisions of the British 30th Corps pushed into the minefields in the dark, sappers working by hand to lift mines that were sometimes buried in layers under fire. Progress was slower than planned. The armoured divisions of the 10th Corps, which were supposed to pass through the cleared corridors and exploit into open ground, couldn't get through quickly enough. By the morning of the 24th of October, the operation was already behind schedule, and Montgomery was confronted with the gap between plan and reality that every commander faces in combat. He adjusted. The second phase, which he called dogfight, was a grinding, attritional battle within the enemy's defensive position. Exactly the kind of battle Rommel hadn't prepared for and couldn't easily win. Rommel was in Germany receiving medical treatment when the battle opened. He flew back to Africa on the 25th of October to find a situation that was already deteriorating. The Axis command had available two German panzer divisions, the 15th and 21st, and the German 9th Light Division, plus multiple Italian formations. The problem was fuel. German quartermaster records from this period show that the Afrika Army's fuel reserves were critically low. British submarines and aircraft had sunk multiple fuel tankers in the Mediterranean in the weeks before the battle. Rommel's capacity to conduct the mobile counterattacks that had defined his earlier success was severely constrained by the simple physics of how far a tank could move on the fuel available to it. He tried 3 times in the first week of the battle to mount significant counterattacks. All 3 were contained. Montgomery delivered his decisive stroke in the early hours of the 2nd of November. Operation Supercharge was a concentrated assault through the northern sector of the Axis line, using the 1st Armoured Division and the 2nd New Zealand Division as the spearhead. It broke through. By the 3rd of November, Rommel was reporting to Berlin that his army was at the point of disintegration. He asked permission to withdraw. Hitler initially refused. One of those interventions from the top that was to become familiar in this campaign. But the reality on the ground overrode the order from Berlin. On the 4th of November, Rommel ordered the retreat. By the 6th of November, the Second Battle of El Alamein was effectively over. The Axis had lost 9,000 dead, 15,000 wounded, and 30,000 taken prisoner. The British had lost 4,800 dead and 9,000 wounded, a significant cost but proportionally far lower than the Axis toll. The Eighth Army began its pursuit west. That pursuit and the questions historians have raised about why it didn't catch and destroy Rommel's retreating forces more quickly is a separate argument. What matters for the architecture of the campaign we're following is this. On the 8th of November 1942, the same day that Torch began in the west, Rommel's army was in full retreat from Egypt. The vice was closing. Africa was caught between two allied forces. The only question was how long the Axis could hold the center. Chapter 4, Tunisia, Mud, Mountains, and the Race That Failed. I want to be precise about something that general histories of this campaign tend to soft pedal. The Allied failure to capture Tunis quickly in November and December of 1942 was not simply a matter of bad weather or difficult terrain, though both contributed. It was also a reflection of genuine organizational and doctrinal problems in the Allied forces, particularly the British First Army, and increasingly, the American forces moving forward, that were going to have to be worked out the hard way. The winter campaign in Tunisia was where those problems became visible, and visibility was the first step toward fixing them. General Kenneth Anderson's British First Army faced a specific and daunting challenge in pushing east from Algeria. The supply line running from Algiers to the front, eventually stretching more than 800 kilometers, had to travel over a single road and rail route that was entirely inadequate for the volume of supplies required. The Algerian port of Algiers was not built for military throughput at this scale. Bone, on the eastern Algerian coast, was closer to the front but small. When the rains came in November and turned the Tunisian plains to mud, the problem became acute. Tracked vehicles chewed up road surfaces that wheeled supply trucks then couldn't navigate, creating a cascading logistics failure that compressed the combat power actually available at the front to a fraction of what was technically committed on paper. Anderson didn't have enough supplies to sustain a major offensive, so he didn't launch one. At the German end of the line, the speed of the build-up in Tunisia surprised even some German planners. Hitler, recognizing that Tunisia was now a critical bridgehead, poured in reinforcements through the Tunisian ports of Tunis and Bizerte with a speed and urgency that the Axis logistics system rarely demonstrated elsewhere in this period of the war. By December of 1942, the Axis forces in Tunisia, organized as the 5th Panzer Army under General Jürgen von Arnim, who'd arrived from the Eastern Front, numbered more than 80,000 men. They were holding a defensive line in the mountains of the Eastern Dorsale that was well suited to defense. The passes through those mountains, names that were about to enter the vocabulary of every American soldier in theater, were narrow, overlooked, and covered by German artillery. The Americans were entering the frontline picture for the first time in a sustained way during this period. The United States Second Corps, under General Lloyd Fredendall, was given responsibility for a sector of the Tunisian front in the area around the Dorsale Mountains. Here I want to pause and acknowledge something that the primary sources make very clear. The American force at the end of 1942 and the beginning of 1943 was not, operationally, the force it would become. The doctrine was not settled. The relationship between tanks and infantry and artillery, the combined arms coordination that was essential for fighting against a German force that had been doing exactly that since 1939, wasn't yet practiced, instinctive, or reliable. The command arrangements were complicated by national sensitivities, and General Fredendall himself was, by any fair assessment of the documentary evidence, not the man for the command he'd been given. What Fredendall did in Tunisia in late 1942 and early 1943 is extensively documented and not particularly flattering. He established his command post in a ravine near Tebessa, a considerable distance from the front, deep enough to require significant engineer labor to excavate, and communicated with his forward units primarily by radio and a private code that confused subordinates and obscured his intentions. He did not visit the front. He expressed contempt for his British allies in terms that were recorded in American reports. He gave orders that divided his armoured strength and positioned it in ways that made rapid concentration in response to a German attack difficult. These are documented facts, not editorial interpretation. The Americans who served under him were not fools. Several of them attempted, through appropriate channels, to raise concerns. The command system absorbed those concerns slowly. The German attack came from the south and southeast, beginning in the middle of February of 1943. What is known historically as the Battle of Kasserine Pass was actually a series of interconnected engagements across the central Tunisian front, beginning with attacks at Faid Pass and Sidi Bouzid before the main thrust toward Kasserine. On the 14th of February, a date with a grim irony that nobody needed, German armour, including the formidable Tiger tank with its 88mm main gun, hit American positions that were held by units equipped with M3 Stuart light tanks and light anti-tank guns that were simply outmatched at the ranges the Tigers chose to engage from. The American units at Sidi Bouzid were effectively destroyed. The survivors fell back, and the retreat, once started, gathered momentum in the way that retreats do when command is uncertain and roads are congested. The pass at Kasserine itself, a gap in the Grand Dorsale Mountains through which the road to the Allied supply base at Tebessa ran, was held on the 19th of February by a mix of American and some British and French units. The defences were not well organised. The pass fell relatively quickly under the assault of a veteran German-Italian force that knew exactly what combined arms looked like. Allied losses at Kasserine and the battles around it reached approximately 10,000 casualties. Axis losses were roughly 2,000. It was, in the precise words of the official British assessment of the action, a serious tactical reverse. In blunter terms, it was a humiliation. And it was a humiliation that was going to be reported in the American press, read by American families, and discussed in the American Congress. The Axis advanced through and beyond the pass did not, as it turned out, achieve its potential. The terrain beyond Kasserine became increasingly mountainous. Allied artillery, particularly the American artillery, which was one arm that had functioned well throughout the battle, even when the infantry and armour hadn't, was inflicting serious damage on the advancing German columns. Rommel, who had taken command of the Kasserine operation personally, made a key decision that has been debated since. Rather than driving hard on Tebessa, which would have required a longer northward loop, he directed the main thrust more directly northwest, toward Thala. That direction was effectively stopped by a combination of British reinforcements and deteriorating weather. By the 25th of February, the Axis forces had withdrawn back through Kasserine Pass, and the Allies reoccupied it. The aftermath was swift, and in the American Army's case, necessary. Fredendall was relieved of command. The officer sent to replace him was Major General George S. Patton, who arrived at the 2nd Corps headquarters on the 6th of March of 1943. The atmosphere at 2nd Corps headquarters was, by accounts of those present, transformed within the first 24 hours. Patton was loud, vain, demanding, and possessed of an absolutely unambiguous belief in discipline as the foundation of combat performance. He issued orders about helmet liners and necktie pins that some officers found absurd. He was probably right about them anyway. The army that came out of Kasserine needed to believe in itself again, and it needed to see that its commanders believed in it. That wasn't an organizational problem. It was a psychological one. Patton understood that. Chapter 5. Patton, Points of Pressure, and the turning of the American army. The week that George Patton took command of the United States Second Corps and the week that the Second Battle of El Alamein concluded are separated by roughly 4 months. But in terms of what they represent, the emergence of American military effectiveness in the European theatre, they belong to the same story. Kasserine broke something. March and April of 1943 rebuilt it, and the instrument of that rebuilding was a combination of Patton's theatrical ferocity, the quiet, systematic reforms of his intelligence and operations staffs, and the simple fact that American soldiers were now fighting an enemy they'd studied, been beaten by, and were determined to beat back. I want to be careful here about the Patton mythology, because it can get away from you very quickly if you're not paying attention to the actual operational record. Patton was not an organizational reformer in the technical sense. He didn't redesign the Second Corps' logistics chain or fundamentally alter its combat doctrine in the weeks he commanded it. What he did, and this is documented in his own diary, in the after-action reports of his subordinate commanders, and in the accounts of junior officers who served under him at this time, was restore a sense of professional self-respect to a formation that had lost it. He was also, and this is equally important, commanding in a period when the Germans in Tunisia were already under severe strategic pressure from multiple directions. The conditions for American success in March and April of 1943 were better than the conditions had been in February, independently of who was in command. The Axis position in Tunisia in March of 1943 was genuinely precarious, though it didn't look that way from some angles. The supply situation was worsening by the week. Allied air power, increasingly coordinated under Air Marshal Arthur Tedder in a command arrangement that would prove enormously influential for later Allied operations, was targeting the Tunisian ports and the supply convoys crossing from Sicily with growing effectiveness. The German and Italian armies in Tunisia were consuming ammunition, fuel, and equipment at a rate that the logistics system couldn't replenish. Rommel himself was exhausted and ill. He left Tunisia for the last time on the 9th of March of 1943, nominally on sick leave, and never returned. He was replaced in overall Axis command by von Arnim. The departure of Rommel from the theatre, where he'd made his reputation, was itself a signal, though it wasn't immediately understood as one by all observers. The Allied plan for the spring campaign in Tunisia involved a carefully coordinated pressure from multiple directions. The British Eighth Army, which had now pushed west across Libya and into southern Tunisia, would apply pressure from the south. The First Army in the north and centre would push from the west. The American Second Corps, repositioned to the northern sector of the front in a significant logistical undertaking completed in April, would drive east toward Bizerte, the northern port. The intent was to compress the Axis bridgehead from all sides until it collapsed. This was, in principle, the same concept that had underlain the entire strategic vision of Torch and El Alamein from the beginning. The reality of executing it involved coordination problems, rivalries between national contingents, and terrain that seemed purpose-built to slow armies down. The Americans' performance in the spring offensive of 1943 was markedly different from their performance at Kasserine. At El Guettar in mid-March, the Second Corps, with Patton in command, and the 9th Infantry Division and the 1st Infantry Division as the primary formations, engaged the German 10th Panzer Division and held, then pushed forward. The 10th Panzer's attack on the first day of the engagement was met by prepared artillery and anti-tank defences that functioned as they were supposed to function. American artillery in particular, the Corps Field Artillery battalions, performed with precision and effect. The Germans suffered significant tank losses and withdrew. It was the first clear American tactical victory against German armour in the European theatre. And I don't think it's possible to overstate how much it mattered psychologically for the formation and for the wider Allied effort. Patton left the Second Corps Command in mid-April. He was replaced by General Omar Bradley, who would remain in command through the end of the Tunisian campaign. The transition was smooth, which itself said something about the organizational health of the Corps by that point. Bradley's style was different from Patton's, quieter, more methodical, less invested in personal theatre, but the Corps he received was functional in a way the Corps Patton had received had not been. The drama of individual command personality matters less to military effectiveness than the doctrine, the training, and the basic organizational competence underneath. Patton had helped restore the last of those. Bradley was going to build on it. In the same weeks that the American Corps was repositioning and the First Army was pressing from the west, the Eighth Army was working through the Mareth Line, a series of fortifications in southern Tunisia, originally built by the French, and then through the Wadi Akarit position north of Gabes. The Mareth operation in late March was initially difficult. The frontal assault on the line's coastal sector failed to break through quickly, and Montgomery had to commit his outflanking force, the New Zealand Corps under Lieutenant General Bernard Freyberg, in a wide left hook through the desert to the west. The left hook worked. The Axis abandoned the Mareth line and fell back to Wadi Akarit. The Eighth Army broke that position on the 6th of April. By mid-April, the Eighth Army was in contact with the First Army in the Tunisian interior. The two ends of the Allied vice had met. The Axis were now contained in a shrinking perimeter around the northern tip of Tunisia. What was happening inside that perimeter in April and early May of 1943 was, from an Axis perspective, a progressive unraveling. Resupply across the Mediterranean had become an increasingly desperate operation. The Allies had established sufficient air superiority over the strait between Sicily and Tunisia that the large convoys that had sustained the Africa Army through the winter were no longer viable. An operation to fly in supplies by transport aircraft, using large formations of Junkers transports, was being intercepted by Allied fighters at a rate that made it unsustainable. German records from this period show that the formations in Tunisia were receiving a fraction of their required daily tonnage of supplies and were drawing down reserves that couldn't be replaced. The mathematical conclusion was inevitable. It was only a question of exactly when and exactly how. The mood inside the Axis perimeter was not, by the accounts of those who were there, one of straightforward despair. There were German units that remained operationally effective and aggressive until very close to the end. There were Italian formations that fought with considerably more tenacity than their reputation in Allied popular history suggests. But the strategic picture was understood by the commanders, even if it wasn't broadcast to every private in every foxhole. Von Arnim knew what was coming. The men in the command posts of the Africa Army's constituent formations knew. The question of whether to attempt an evacuation, a Dunkirk operation in reverse, was discussed at the highest levels. Hitler rejected it. He wanted Tunisia held as long as possible, to delay Allied operations toward Italy. The men who were going to pay the price of that decision were not sitting in Berlin. Chapter 6, The Siege Tightens, April 1943. By the first week of April of 1943, Tunisia had become the only place in the entire theatre where the war in North Africa was still being actively fought, and everyone on both sides of the line understood that its conclusion was a matter of weeks rather than months. What remained to be determined was how the final act would play out in detail, which formations would break through where, which ports would fall first, and what would become of the hundreds of thousands of Axis soldiers compressed into the narrowing corridor of northern Tunisia. These were not trivial questions. The answers would shape the resources available to both sides for everything that came after, including the Allied invasion of Sicily that was already being planned in the headquarters of the 15th Army Group. The Allied command structure into Tunisia by April of 1943 was considerably more coherent than it had been at the start of the campaign. Eisenhower commanded overall from his headquarters at Algiers. Ground operations were coordinated by General Harold Alexander's 18th Army Group, which contained Anderson's 1st Army in the north and center, the American 2nd Corps on the northern flank, and Montgomery's 8th Army in the south. Air support was centralized under Ted's Mediterranean Air Command in a way that represented a genuine doctrinal advance. The co-equal treatment of air power as a campaign-shaping force rather than an auxiliary to the ground battle. This was not universally popular with ground commanders who would have preferred air assets assigned to their individual formations. But the results would speak for themselves. The Axis bridgehead by April had contracted to roughly the northeastern corner of Tunisia. Anchored on the cities of Tunis and Bizerte, the defensive terrain, the hills and ridges of Cap Bon, and the Atlas foothills was genuinely difficult. German engineers had used the winter to prepare positions, lay mines, establish fields of fire. The formations holding those positions included some of the most experienced German infantry and armor in the theater. The assault was not going to be a walkover simply because the strategic situation was decided. Someone was going to have to take those hills in the old-fashioned way. Infantry, by daylight, uphill, under fire. The armies preparing to do that were themselves tired. The First Army had been in continuous operations for 6 months. The Eighth Army had been fighting, with relatively brief pauses, since 1940. Even with the knowledge that this was the final chapter, the physical and psychological wear on the formations was real. The battle for the Fondouac Pass in early April illustrated both the progress the Allies had made and the problems that still persisted. The plan required the American 9th Division and the British 6th Armoured Division to break through the pass and cut the 8th Army's intended escape route for Axis forces retreating from the Mareth Line. The attack on the 7th of April was poorly coordinated. The infantry assault didn't adequately clear the anti-tank defences before the armour was committed, and the armoured brigade suffered significant losses before the pass was finally taken. The timing failure meant that the Axis forces retreating from the south passed the Fondouac area before the Allies could cut them off. Montgomery was critical, and the records show that the criticism contributed to a painful internal argument about coordination between 1st and 8th Army formations that reached Alexander's level. It's uncomfortable reading, but these are the kinds of friction points that real campaigns generate, and they're worth understanding. The American 2nd Corps in the north was fighting its way toward Bizerte against German and Italian formations that were executing something the Wehrmacht had practiced extensively on the Eastern Front: organized elastic defense in depth, trading ground for time and casualties, pulling back to prepared positions, counterattacking when the attacker overextended, making every kilometer cost something. The 90th Light Division, a German formation that had been in North Africa since 1941, was among the units conducting this defense. The Americans were learning in real time. At the tactical level, the integration of infantry, artillery, and tank destroyer units was improving week by week. But the learning still cost lives. That's how tactical learning works in combat. And the honest accounting of any campaign has to acknowledge it. One of the operational decisions that shaped the final weeks of the campaign was Alexander's instruction, issued in mid-April, that reallocated sectors and attack axes for the final push. The American 2nd Corps was given the objective of Bizerte, driving along the northern coastal route. The British First Army's Ninth Corps was given the central axis toward Tunis. The Eighth Army would continue pressure from the south and east. The coordination required was detailed and, in some respects, politically sensitive. Eisenhower was aware that the American army needed a visible role in the final victory, both for domestic political reasons and for the longer-term question of American prestige in the coalition. Alexander's revised plan gave the Americans Bizerte. It was the right call on both military and political grounds. In the German command structure, April of 1943 was a month of increasingly futile communications with Berlin. Von Arnim was requesting permission to begin a phased evacuation of key personnel and equipment. Berlin was declining. The situation was being described in German operational communications as holding in place. German Army Group Africa records from this period, portions of which have been available to historians since the post-war decades, show clearly that senior German commanders in Tunisia understood the material situation was irrecoverable, but continued to transmit optimistic assessments upward, not from dishonesty, but from the institutional pressure of a command culture that had made delivering bad news to the Führer a career-ending, and sometimes life-ending, event. Italian formations in Tunisia in April of 1943 present a more complicated picture than the Allied operational reports tend to allow for. The standard narrative, which the Axis performance at Kasserine and in several other engagements in this campaign partially supports, is of Italian forces as unreliable, poorly motivated, and quick to surrender when pressed. That narrative is not uniformly accurate. Some Italian formations, particularly those that had been in North Africa for multiple years and had developed experienced NCO and officer cadres, fought with skill and determination through the spring of 1943. The First Italian Army, under Field Marshal Giovanni Mess, was, by the documentary evidence of the final weeks of the campaign, mounting a coherent defense in the south until nearly the end. Messi himself surrendered personally on the 13th of May, the last senior Axis commander to do so, in circumstances that involved a negotiation about terms. Evidence that the Italian command retained its organizational integrity until the very end. The close air support campaign in April reached a scale and effectiveness that had simply not been possible in the first months of the Torch operation. Allied air power, American, British, and from other Commonwealth air forces, was now operating from bases in Algeria and Tunisia itself, putting fighter and fighter-bomber sorties over the Tunisian front and over the strait between Sicily and Tunisia simultaneously. The interdiction of Axis sea and air supply routes in April and May reached its maximum effectiveness precisely when the need was most desperate. German and Italian records show transport losses in the final weeks that made resupply essentially symbolic rather than operationally meaningful. The Axis forces in Tunisia were consuming their stockpiles. When the stockpiles were gone, the ability to resist was gone. By the end of April, the compressed perimeter around northern Tunisia was barely 50 kilometers deep in places. The men inside it, perhaps 270,000 German and Italian soldiers, by the best estimates available to Allied intelligence at the time, were on reduced rations, short of ammunition, and in receipt of communications from their high commands that bore decreasing relationship to the reality they could observe from the window of any command post. The final assault was coming. Everyone knew it. On both sides of the line, in the hills above Tunis and the plains north of Bizerte, men were doing the calculations. The ammunition counts, the fuel reserves, the defensive positions, that told them how many more days this could go on. The answer from the 1st of May forward was not many. Chapter 7. The Fall of Tunis and Bizerte. There is a specific kind of silence that falls over a battlefield when both sides understand that the decision has already been made, when the fighting continues because no one has yet issued the order to stop, but the outcome is no longer in any real doubt. Tunisia in the first week of May of 1943 had that quality. The Allied armies were coiled against a perimeter that had shrunk to roughly a quarter of the territory the Axis had held in February. Inside that perimeter, the German and Italian formations were burning documents, destroying equipment they couldn't move, and making the private calculations that soldiers make when the institutional direction has run ahead of the individual's ability to believe in it. Outside it, the Allied corps were preparing what Alexander intended to be the final, decisive stroke. Not a cautious probing operation, but a concentrated punch aimed directly at Tunis, timed to prevent any organized Axis evacuation, and designed to collapse the entire defense before the Germans could shorten their lines again. Alexander's plan for the final offensive, launched on the 6th of May of 1943, was built around a concentrated armoured thrust by the British Ninth Corps in the centre of the front. The axis of advance pointed directly at Tunis, along the Mejez El Bab road, a route that had been contested for months, but which the engineers had worked to bring to a condition that could sustain the movement of heavy armour at speed. The key formation was the 6th and 7th Armoured Divisions, and the preparatory artillery concentration that preceded the assault was, by the accounts of those who observed it, among the most intense of the entire North African campaign. The infantry divisions of the 5th Corps secured the flanks. The armour was instructed to go through and not stop. What Alexander wanted was not a methodical advance from ridge to ridge. He wanted a rupture, a complete penetration, a drive to Tunis at tank speed that would cut through the German defence before it could reorganise. It worked. The 6th Armoured Division broke through the German position on the morning of the 6th of May and began driving east at a pace that the Axis defensive system simply couldn't keep up with. German anti-tank positions that would, a week earlier, have required a set-piece infantry assault to reduce were bypassed, with the armour pressing on and leaving the mopping up to the following infantry. By the evening of the 6th Armoured was more than 30 kilometres beyond the start line. The speed of the advance was disorienting even to the Allied formations behind it. Supply convoys and artillery units struggled to keep pace, and there were hours during the 7th of May when the forward elements of the armour were essentially unsupported except by the speed of their own movement. That speed was itself a form of protection. The German command couldn't respond faster than the British tanks were advancing. Tunis fell on the 7th of May, 1943. The 6th Armoured Division entered the city in the afternoon. Contemporary accounts from those who were in the streets, and there are several from both British soldiers and Tunisian civilians, describe a city that was both celebrating and still dangerous, with sporadic German resistance continuing in some quarters even as crowds filled the main boulevards. The actual moment of the city's fall is one of those historical events where the clean narrative of "on this date, at this hour" somewhat misrepresents the reality of a city changing hands in stages over several hours. What is clear is that by the evening of the 7th, the centre of Tunis was in Allied hands, and the German command had abandoned any hope of organising a defence of the city. Bizerte fell on the same day, the 7th of May, to the American 2nd Corps, which had been driving east through the northern corridor for the preceding weeks. The converging fall of both major Tunisian ports on the same day was an Allied operational success of the first order. The capture of the ports intact, or nearly intact, was militarily significant. The Allies needed Tunis and Bizerte as logistical hubs for the Sicily operation that was already in advanced planning. And while German demolition teams had done damage to both harbours, the infrastructure was recoverable in a matter of weeks rather than months. The American entry into Bizerte completed a journey for the Second Corps that had begun in the aftermath of Kasserine as a process of institutional recovery. The distance between the Kasserine Pass and the docks of Bizerte was not just geographical. It was the distance the American army had travelled from its first serious encounter with the Wehrmacht to its first strategic victory. The German response to the loss of both cities was, at the command level, an acknowledgement of what had already been structurally true for weeks. Von Arnim issued orders that effectively dissolved the organized defense, instructing formation commanders to act as local circumstances required, which in practical terms meant surrender or continued resistance at the discretion of individual commanders. The 5th Panzer Army's operations were no longer coherent as a corps-level enterprise. Individual regiments and battalions held positions based on the personalities and decisions of their immediate commanders, not in response to a coordinated defensive plan. This dissolution of command cohesion is one of the classical signatures of an army in the final stages of disintegration, and it had a direct effect on the pace of the final Allied advance. Von Arnim himself was captured on the 12th of May of 1943. The circumstances of his capture, found in a farmhouse by a patrol of the 4th Indian Infantry Division, are well documented and contain a kind of quiet dignity that the subsequent Allied treatment of him broadly honoured. He had commanded the Axis forces in Tunisia from January onward with a degree of professional competence that the operational situation made irrelevant to the outcome. He was taken to Britain as a prisoner of war. I find myself, reading the accounts of his capture, struck by the gap between the scale of what he'd commanded and the smallness of the moment of surrender. A general in a farmhouse, handing a weapon to a patrol that hadn't expected to find him there. The days between the fall of Tunis and Bizerte and the formal end of Axis resistance on the 13th of May were not, as the phrase mopping up implies, without cost. German and Italian units that had not received or had not accepted the dissolution orders continued to resist. The Cap Bon Peninsula, the narrow finger of land northeast of Tunis that juts into the Mediterranean towards Sicily, became the final concentration point for many Axis soldiers attempting to find some route of escape or making a last stand. Allied forces advanced down the peninsula. The sea, as it had at Dunkirk in the other direction 3 years earlier, offered no salvation. The Royal Navy was in the strait. The Luftwaffe had lost the air over the channel. Boats that attempted to leave were intercepted. The number of Axis personnel evacuated from Tunisia successfully is, based on available records, a small fraction of the total force, in the low thousands, compared to the hundreds of thousands who remained. The surrender on the 13th of May was not a single, formal, documented ceremony in the way that the German surrender of 1945 would later be. It was a process of individual formations and units laying down weapons over the course of several days, with the formal declaration of the end of organized resistance arriving from the Allied command on the 13th. Italian Field Marshal Mess surrendered to the 8th Army on that date, as noted earlier, with a formality that was almost anachronistic given the circumstances. Approximately 230,000 Axis prisoners were taken in the final collapse of the Tunisian bridgehead, a figure that, when compared to the more than 300,000 Germans taken at Stalingrad in February of 1943, gives some sense of the strategic weight of the Tunisian defeat for the Axis. Germany had lost 2 armies in roughly 3 months, one in the Soviet Union, one in Africa. The productive capacity of the Reich to replace those losses in trained manpower and experienced junior leaders was not unlimited. The losses in Tunisia mattered beyond the tactical outcome of one campaign. I've read accounts from men on both sides of the final days in Tunisia, and what strikes me consistently is how mundane the actual moment of surrender was for most of the men who experienced it. Not the command level formalities, those had their own theatre, but the individual soldier's experience of the war ending. Putting a weapon down, sitting in the dust, waiting for someone to come and process them, eating something if there was something to eat, the vast machinery of planning and logistics and command that had moved hundreds of thousands of men across continents and oceans came down at the individual level to a man sitting in the Tunisian sun in May, not quite believing it was over. Chapter 8: What the desert did to the men who fought in it. The history of any campaign can be told in operational terms: movements, dates, objectives taken and lost. And that telling is necessary but not sufficient. It leaves out the question that I find myself returning to repeatedly when I work through the primary sources of the North African campaign. What did this place and this particular kind of war actually do to the men who fought it? Not in the abstract, not as a collective, but individually. To the private soldiers, the junior officers, the NCOs who actually occupied the ground that the operational histories describe with arrows on maps. This chapter is an attempt to bring some of that texture forward, because the documentary record contains it, and leaving it out would be a kind of dishonesty about what war is. The North African theatre had physical characteristics that set it apart from other theatres of the Second World War in ways that affected health, psychology, and performance, in ways that weren't fully understood until after the campaign. The heat, for one thing, was not the uniform furnace that desert mythology suggests. The Western Desert and Tunisia had significant temperature ranges between day and night. Summer days that reached over 40 degrees Celsius, giving way to nights cold enough for frost in the higher ground. Men who arrived in summer kit found themselves ill-equipped for the cold. Men who dug into the rocky Tunisian hills found that the ground didn't yield to shovels the way training ground soil had. The water supply was a constant operational concern. The desert's geology and the absence of infrastructure meant that frontline units were often dependent on water trucks, whose arrival schedules were disrupted by the same operational factors that disrupted everything else. There are regimental histories of British formations in Tunisia that list water shortage as a significant constraint on operational capability, in a way that the operational summaries don't fully reflect. Disease, particularly in the early months of the campaign, was a serious factor in the reduction of unit strength. Dysentery, jaundice, and what was commonly called desert sores, an open skin infection aggravated by sand, heat, and inadequate cleaning water, appeared in the medical returns of virtually every formation in the theatre at some point. The American forces, arriving in November of 1942 without the acclimatization and experience that the British desert formations had built up over 2 years, experienced high rates of sickness in the first weeks. Malaria was a concern in the coastal lowlands of Tunisia, particularly in the spring. The American Army's medical records from the Tunisian campaign show non-battle casualties. Men removed from duty for illness, injury, or psychological crisis, running at rates that sometimes approached the battle casualty figures in static periods. This is not a reflection of weakness. It is the baseline reality of maintaining large formations in a harsh environment over extended periods, and it was experienced by every army in the theatre, Axis included. The psychological dimension of the North African campaign is something that the institutional records of the time addressed with considerable less frankness than later wars would allow. The Second World War's armies, British and American alike, had limited frameworks for understanding and treating what we would now recognize as combat stress or post-traumatic stress disorder. The terminology of the time, battle exhaustion, shell shock in its residual First World War usage, lack of moral fiber in the RAF's particularly brutal phrase, was applied inconsistently and sometimes punitively. Men who broke down under sustained combat stress were sometimes treated as medical cases, sometimes as disciplinary problems. The institutional literature on this is extensive and troubling. What the personal accounts, letters home, diaries where men were honest, reveal is that the sustained uncertainty of the desert campaign, the weeks of waiting broken by intense violence, and then more waiting, affected men in ways that they often didn't have the language to describe. I want to be specific about one thing that the operational histories tend to compress: the experience of being in a tank in the North African campaign. The armoured formations, American, British, German, Italian, were the principal instrument of the mobile desert war, and the relationship between the men inside tanks and the environment they fought in was unlike any other infantry experience. A tank in the western desert in summer was an oven. Temperatures inside the hull reached levels that required crew rotation and hydration management as operational planning considerations. The noise of a tank engagement, the engine, the gun, the radio, was such that crews communicated by touch and signal as much as by speech. Crew members who survived tank fires, and they occurred. The Sherman tank's vulnerability to brew up was noticed by its crews before it was formally acknowledged by its commanders. Carried particular kinds of memories that distinguished their accounts from those of infantrymen who'd fought in the open. The close community of a tank crew, 4 or 5 men in an enclosed space for months, generated bonds that veterans of armoured units in North Africa described, decades later, in terms that are almost domestic in their intimacy. And the violence of losing that crew, the speed of it, the completeness of it, generated losses that were proportionally enormous in their psychological weight. The relationship between British and American soldiers in the theatre is another dimension that the operational histories tend to present either as cheerful Allied cooperation or as the Fredendall-era mutual condescension, without much nuance between those poles. The reality, from the personal accounts, was more textured. There was genuine respect between many British and American soldiers who'd actually fought alongside each other. The kind of respect that comes from seeing another man do a hard thing competently. There was also, particularly in the early months, a degree of mutual incomprehension that went beyond institutional difference. American soldiers who'd grown up with one set of cultural references and British soldiers who'd grown up with another found each other genuinely puzzling in ways that weren't hostile, but weren't comfortable either. The shared experience of Tunisia, the mud, the cold, the German artillery, did more to bridge that gap than any official program of inter-Allied fraternization. You don't argue about cultural differences when you're sharing the same foxhole. The Eighth Army's relationship with the desert was particularly particular, because many of its formations had been in the desert for 2 or more years by the time they entered Tunisia. There was an identity. Desert Rats was the informal collective designation for the 7th Armoured Division, though it was often applied loosely to the whole 8th Army. That was built around the specific conditions of the Western Desert War. The informality of dress, the directness of communication, the contempt for what was sometimes called base wallahs, the staff officers and support troops who spent the war at a comfortable remove from the fighting. Montgomery was somewhat ambivalent about this desert identity. He valued the experience it represented, but was aware that some of its characteristics, particularly the informality that could bleed into indiscipline, created operational problems. The tension between the veteran desert formations and the more formally trained and turned out British units arriving from the United Kingdom was real and is documented in the diaries and letters of officers on both sides of it. The German soldier in Tunisia in the final months of the campaign occupies an uncomfortable position in the historical literature for reasons that are worth acknowledging directly. The Wehrmacht in North Africa had a reputation for fighting by the laws of war that was significantly better than the reputation of German forces in the Soviet Union or German security forces anywhere in occupied Europe. This was largely accurate for this specific theatre for most of the campaign, but it's important to note that this relatively clean conduct was a product of specific circumstances. A relatively small theatre, remote from the centres of Nazi policy, with no significant Jewish population to persecute and no partisan war to brutalize the combat formations. The Afrika Korps' relative cleanliness wasn't a moral achievement in isolation from its context. It was the product of a context that didn't provide the same enabling conditions for atrocity that other theatres did. I think that distinction matters, and the historiography has sometimes been insufficiently clear about it. Prisoners of war from the North African campaign on both sides were, by the documentary record, generally treated in accordance with the Geneva Convention. This was not guaranteed. There are documented incidents of prisoners killed on both sides, particularly in the heat of immediate post-combat situations. But as a general institutional practice, the handling of prisoners in North Africa was considerably better than in other theatres of the same war. American prisoners taken at Kasserine were transported to Italian prison camps via Tunisia and Sicily. British prisoners from earlier desert battles had been held in Italian camps in Libya. The experience varied considerably by camp and by individual Italian or German guards, as the memoir literature documents. But the baseline treatment, food, water, shelter, registration with the Red Cross, was significantly more consistently maintained than in the Pacific or the Eastern Front. One last thing I want to say in this chapter before we move forward: the African soldiers. The campaign in North Africa was fought in Africa, and the historical literature about it is almost entirely written from the perspective of the European and American participants. The French army in North Africa contained significant numbers of North African soldiers. Algerian, Moroccan, and Tunisian troops organized in formations called tirailleurs and gaumes, Indian Army formations, the 4th Indian Infantry Division and others, fought throughout the campaign and were critical to several key engagements. South African formations were present in the earlier desert fighting. These were not peripheral or decorative contributions. At the Wadi Akarir at Enfidaville, in the hills above Medjes El Bab, men from colonial formations that had no direct stake in the European political argument that produced the Second World War fought and died because the structures of empire had placed them there. Their experience of the campaign, their voices in the historical record, which are sparse and mediated through colonial institutional filters, is something the history of this campaign is still, inadequately, working to recover. Chapter 9, Logistics. The war beneath the war, I want to make an argument that might sound dry, but is, I think, essential to understanding why the North African campaign ended the way it did, and when it did. The decisive factor in the Tunisian campaign was not courage, not command genius, and not tactical excellence, though all three were present on both sides. The decisive factor was logistics. The Allied ability to sustain the force in the theatre versus the Axis inability to do so is the deepest structural explanation for the outcome. Everything else, the operational plans, the command decisions, the individual engagements, was played out within a frame whose dimensions were set by the question of who could get what to whom and when. The logistical challenge of the Allied side was enormous but tractable. The United States in 1942 and 1943 was the most productive industrial economy in the world, and it was converting that productivity into military material at a pace that the Axis could not match or plan against. The question wasn't whether American industry could produce enough tanks, trucks, ammunition, and food for the North African campaign. It could, and it did. The question was how to get those materials from American ports to the fighting formations in Tunisia, across an Atlantic that German submarines were still contesting, through Moroccan and Algerian ports whose infrastructure was being built up from an inadequate baseline, along a road and rail network that stretched hundreds of kilometers through difficult terrain. That question was a genuine operational problem, and it consumed an enormous amount of planning energy from Eisenhower's headquarters throughout the campaign. The port of Algiers handled roughly the equivalent of 3,000 tons of cargo per day in the early months of the torch operation, a figure that the port's infrastructure could barely sustain, and that was significantly below what the First Army needed for sustained offensive operations. The solution was a combination of measures: expanding the port capacity at Bone and other smaller Algerian ports, improving the road network east of Algiers with engineer battalions working continuously, and adapting the supply system to work around the single-track rail line that was the backbone of the theatre's logistics. The supply situation improved steadily through the winter and spring as engineer work accumulated and port capacity increased. But at no point in the Tunisian campaign was logistics a problem that had been fully solved. It was a problem that was being continuously managed, and the margin between what was required and what was available shaped operational decisions throughout. American trucks, specifically the 2.5-ton GMC C-Check Doe, which became simply the deuce and a half in the vocabulary of every Allied soldier in the theatre, were the unglamorous backbone of the Allied supply system in Tunisia. Tens of thousands of these vehicles operated the Red Ball equivalent of the North African campaign, running supply columns from the coastal ports to forward depots, and from forward depots to the combat units. They broke down in the mud. They got stuck in the passes. They were shot at by the Luftwaffe. The men who drove them did so for hours on end, in darkness when possible to avoid air attack, on roads that deteriorated under the weight of the military traffic using them. The logistics soldiers of the North African campaign, the truck drivers, the dock workers, the fuel handlers, the ammunition loaders, are the nearly invisible workforce of the operational histories, present in every paragraph's conclusion, supplied and supported, adequately provisioned, and almost never named. The Axis logistics system in Tunisia was facing a problem of a different order entirely. The supplies reaching Tunisia had to cross the Mediterranean from Italian ports, primarily Naples, Palermo, and Messina, in convoys that were subject to Allied air and submarine attack, from bases in Malta, Algeria, and Egypt. The Royal Navy's submarine force, operating from Malta throughout the campaign, had been systematically hunting Italian convoys for 2 years. By the time of the Tunisian campaign, the loss rates on the Mediterranean supply route were significant enough to make every convoy a calculated risk, and the risk was only increasing as Allied air power extended its reach. German records show that the loss rate for tankers carrying fuel, the most critical single commodity for a motorized army, was substantially higher than for general cargo, partly because the Allies were specifically targeting fuel ships that intelligence identified, and partly because burning fuel ships were conspicuous in ways that encouraged follow-up attacks. The fuel crisis in the Axis command in Tunisia was not a sudden emergency that arrived in May of 1943. It was a progressive constraint that had been tightening since at least the autumn of 1942. Rommel's inability to exploit his Kasserine breakthrough fully was partly a fuel problem The limited Axis counterattack operations in March and April were partly fuel problems. Von Arnim's inability to conduct the kind of elastic, mobile defense that might have prolonged resistance was partly a fuel problem. When German tank units were unable to reposition in response to Allied breakthroughs because they didn't have the fuel to move, the operational consequences were direct and irreversible. A tank that runs out of fuel in the wrong position isn't a tactical problem. It's a piece of expensive metal waiting to be captured or destroyed. Air supply, the attempt to compensate for sea supply losses by flying materials into Tunisia, was a bold concept that ran into the hard reality of Allied air superiority. The Luftwaffe transport fleet, primarily Junkers Ju 52 three-engined transports, flew regular missions to Tunisia throughout the campaign. But the scale of what could be moved by air was a small fraction of what was needed, and the loss rate increased as Allied fighter interception improved. The records show that in April of 1943, Allied fighters, American P-38 Lightnings and British Spitfires, operating from Tunisian and Algerian bases, were intercepting German air transport formations with a regularity and effectiveness that was not sustainable for the transport fleet. Operations by the Luftwaffe transport arm in the final weeks of the Tunisian campaign were conducted under conditions of such severe loss that they represented a significant attrition of an asset Germany needed elsewhere. The Italian Navy's role in the supply struggle deserves acknowledgement that it doesn't always receive. The Regia Marina, the Italian Royal Navy, had been the primary instrument of Axis supply convoy protection across the Mediterranean throughout the North African campaign. Its officers and men operated under conditions of severe material disadvantage. Insufficient radar, insufficient anti-aircraft armament on escort vessels, and the persistent and pervasive intelligence advantage that the British had through the breaking of Axis naval codes. The convoy crews knew that their routes were anticipated. They knew that British submarines and aircraft were waiting. They sailed anyway, because their army in North Africa needed what they were carrying. The loss rate was severe. The institutional records of the Italian Navy from this period document a logistical effort that was, by any reasonable assessment, conducted with commitment and professional skill. And that ultimately failed because the structural advantages were on the other side. The Allied decision to prioritize the destruction of Axis supply lines systematically as a campaign objective in its own right, not just as an opportunistic secondary mission, was an early example of what would later be called interdiction campaign doctrine. The coordination between naval and air forces targeting the Mediterranean supply route was not seamless. There were arguments about priorities, jurisdictional disputes between commands, and operational constraints that prevented complete coverage. But the cumulative effect over the 6 months of the Tunisian campaign was decisive. The Axis army that began the campaign with adequate, if stretched, logistics ended it unable to move its armor, unable to respond to Allied breakthroughs, and unable to evacuate its personnel. The interdiction campaign was the deep structural cause of that. Every other factor operated within the space it created. I want to end this chapter with an observation that is sometimes resisted by military historians who prefer operational explanation over material explanation. The Axis could not have won in Tunisia. By November of 1942, the material balance had tipped past the point of operational redress. Individual German tactical excellence could delay the outcome and could make the Allied armies pay for their advances. And it did both. But no level of Rommel's operational art or German infantry skill could compensate for an industrial and logistical imbalance that was running against the Axis at a rate of hundreds of thousands of tons per month. The German and Italian soldiers in Tunisia were not defeated by better fighting. They were defeated by an enemy that could sustain its army in the field, and they, ultimately, could not. That is a hard thing for military historians with an instinct for great commanders and decisive engagements to sit with. But it is what the evidence, taken as a whole, shows. Chapter 10: The Allied Air War over North Africa. Something shifted in the way the Allies thought about air power during the North African campaign, and I want to spend this chapter on that shift because it mattered enormously, not just for the outcome in Tunisia, but for everything that followed. Sicily, Italy, Normandy, the entire strategic air campaign over Europe. The change that happened in the skies, over the desert, and over Tunisia between November of 1942 and May of 1943 was not primarily technological. Though the aircraft got better, it was doctrinal. The Allied air forces figured out, in the crucible of North Africa, how air power ought to be used in a combined arms campaign. The principles they arrived at became the foundation of Allied air doctrine for the rest of the war. The starting point, at the beginning of the torch period, was a system of air support that was fragmented and, in the assessment of the commanders who reviewed it after the campaign, counterproductive. The British First Army and the American Second Corps each had tactical air assets assigned to support them. Those assets were controlled by ground commanders, who used them primarily to respond to immediate requests from frontline units. Close air support, covering a specific infantry position, attacking a specific enemy gun. The effect was an air force that was always reacting to the ground battle, rather than shaping it. And that was never concentrated enough in one place to achieve decisive effect. It was also an air force that was being used inefficiently. Aircraft that could have been striking German supply convoys or attacking airfields were instead flying patrols over friendly positions at the request of infantrymen who wanted the reassurance of friendly aircraft overhead. The disaster at Kasserine, specifically the effectiveness of German air support during the Axis breakthrough, and the comparative ineffectiveness of Allied air response, served as a catalyst for reform. Air Marshal Arthur Tedder, commanding the Mediterranean Air Command, and his subordinate Air Marshal Mary Conyngham, commanding the tactical air forces, had been arguing for a different doctrine before Kasserine. Kasserine gave them the argument in a form that ground commanders and Eisenhower's headquarters couldn't ignore. The reform was codified in the famous Field Manual 21-100, the American doctrinal document on air-ground operations, and in the organizational changes that concentrated all Allied tactical air under a single air commander, equal in status to the ground commander, not subordinate to him. The practical result of this doctrinal change was visible in the spring offensive. Instead of air assets divided among ground commanders, all Allied tactical aircraft in Tunisia were controlled by Coningham's headquarters, which allocated them according to a priorities framework. First, air superiority, achieving and maintaining control of the air over the battlefield. Second, interdiction, attacking supply lines, ports, airfields, and transport behind the enemy lines. Third, close air support, direct attacks on enemy forces in contact with Allied troops. This framework explicitly prioritized the long-range effects of air power over the immediate comfort of frontline troops, and it produced results that the previous fragmented system hadn't. By April and May of 1943, the Luftwaffe over Tunisia was operating under conditions of such severe Allied air pressure that it could no longer reliably contest the air over the front lines. German and Italian formations were being attacked by Allied fighter bombers with a frequency and freedom from interference that would have been unimaginable 6 months earlier. The aircraft types in the theatre during the Tunisian campaign are worth a moment of attention because the equipment on both sides was in a period of transition that affected tactical possibilities in specific ways. The British Spitfire Mark V, which was the primary RF fighter in the theatre for most of the campaign, was matched closely in performance by the Messerschmitt Bf 109G variant that the Luftwaffe was introducing during the same period. Neither side had a clear technical superiority in fighter versus fighter terms in 1943 Tunisia. What the Allies had was numerical superiority and improving organization. The American P-38 Lightning, a twin-engine, twin-boom fighter that was entering service in North Africa in significant numbers during the winter of 1942 to 1943, had particular value as a long-range interceptor and proved effective against the German transport formations over the Sicilian Strait. The A-20 Havoc and the Mitchell B-25 medium bombers, flying from Algerian bases, became the primary instruments of the interdiction campaign against Tunisian ports and Axis airfields. German air power in Tunisia was limited by the same logistical constraints that limited the ground forces. The Luftwaffe in the Mediterranean theatre had been stretched by the simultaneous demands of the Eastern Front, the defence of Western Europe, and the North African theatre. Aircraft losses in Tunisia could only be partially replaced, and the replacement pilots arriving in the theatre had less training and experience than those they were replacing. A pattern that was becoming chronic across the Luftwaffe as a whole by this period of the war. The Messerschmitt units that had been in North Africa since 1941 still contained experienced pilots who were genuinely dangerous opponents in individual engagements. But the overall capacity of the Luftwaffe in Tunisia to maintain air superiority over the battlefield declined continuously from late 1942 onward, and the attempts to reverse that decline with reinforcements couldn't keep pace with Allied growth. The bombing campaign against Tunisian ports and the Mediterranean crossing, which I touched on in the logistics chapter from the Axis perspective, deserves a note from the Allied planning perspective as well. The coordination between the Northwest African Air Forces, the American designation for Sparta's command, the RF Middle East, and the Royal Navy in targeting the sea supply route required a level of inter-service and inter-allied coordination that had not existed at the start of the Torch period. It was built, sometimes awkwardly, through the winter and spring. The creation of the Northwest African Coastal Air Force, a specifically anti-shipping and convoy escort command, was a direct organizational response to the recognized importance of the maritime interdiction mission. Its effectiveness in the final months of the campaign was, as the logistics chapter documented, strategically decisive. The relationship between the air war and the ground war in Tunisia contained a lesson that Allied planners absorbed and that shaped every subsequent operation. Air superiority was not simply a desirable condition, but a prerequisite. Ground operations that were conducted without air cover were expensive, in a way that ground operations conducted under friendly air cover were not. The contrast between the German ability to move freely by day in the early months of the campaign and its inability to do so in April and May illustrated the point with the clarity of a demonstration. Columns that moved by day in March attracted air attack. Columns that moved by day in May were destroyed. The calculation was simple, and it drove German operational planning into increasingly defensive patterns that the ground forces could then exploit. One aspect of the air war that I want to spend a moment on, because it's often omitted from the operational histories, is the experience of the air crews themselves. The North African campaign consumed aircraft and aircrew at rates that the public histories rarely quantify carefully. Allied air forces flying interdiction and close support missions over Tunisia were operating over territory that was defended by substantial concentrations of German light and medium anti-aircraft artillery. The German flak arm which had distinguished itself in the Desert War as both an anti-aircraft and an anti-tank weapon. Flying low enough to be accurate against ground targets meant flying into that anti-aircraft fire. Loss rates for medium bombers flying at medium altitude over defended targets could run to several percent per mission in the most intense periods. For the crews flying those missions repeatedly, and crew rotation policies in the North African theatre were still being developed in 1942 and early 1943. The statistical accumulation of those loss rates over a tour of operations was significant. The records of American bomb groups that flew from Algerian bases through the Tunisian campaign show the cumulative effect of sustained operations on crew strength and morale. And the human accounting in those records deserves attention alongside the operational outcomes they helped achieve. The conclusion of the air campaign over North Africa, the achievement of unchallenged Allied air supremacy over the Tunisian battlefield by May of 1943, was not an accident of geography or a gift of superior technology. It was the product of doctrinal reform made under pressure, of organizational innovation built on the evidence of failure, and of the accumulated professional learning of the air crews and commanders who fought through the campaign's difficult late phases and arrived at its end with a capability that hadn't existed when they started. The Air Force that flew over Normandy in June of 1944 was built on the doctrinal foundation laid in the skies over Tunisia. That connection is direct, documented, and essential to understanding both campaigns. Chapter 11, Rommel, the general, the myth, and the distance between them. I want to be honest about something before I begin this chapter. The historiography of Erwin Rommel is a problem in itself, separate from the historiography of the campaign he participated in. The Desert Fox mythology, Rommel as the brilliant, chivalrous, almost sports-like opponent who won battles through instinct and audacity and conducted himself throughout with the honor of a warrior from an earlier age, is a post-war construction that was built in large part by the very British commanders who'd been beaten by him. It served a psychological function for the British Army. If the enemy who defeated you was a genius, then your defeat reflected less on you. It served a broader political function in the reconstruction of West Germany after the war. Rommel's documented connection to the July 20 of 1944 bomb plot against Hitler provided a retrospective moral rehabilitation that was institutionally convenient for the new German state, and it served a publishing and popular history function that has made Rommel the subject of more books than almost any other commander of the Second World War. None of this means Rommel wasn't a capable commander. He was. The Western Desert Campaign between February of 1941 and November of 1942 documented genuine operational skill. The speed of decision, the personal presence at critical points, the ability to read the flow of a mobile battle and redirect resources faster than the opponent could respond. These are real qualities, and the after-action assessments of British commanders who fought him directly attest to them. What the mythology often omits, or treats as secondary, is the other side of the ledger. The logistical neglect, the operational overextension, the pattern of driving forward until the supply situation forced a halt, the tolerance for personal risk that produced inspired leadership on some days and disrupted staff coordination on others. The Rommel who drove too fast too far without securing his supply base was the same Rommel who won battles in ways that the textbooks then taught. The two were inseparable. Rommel arrived in Africa in February of 1941 as commander of what was then called the German Africa Corps. 2 divisions, initially, sent to prevent the complete collapse of the Italian position after the British Western Desert Force had destroyed the Italian 10th Army in a campaign of about 2 months. His orders were defensive, to hold a line in Tripolitania. His instinct, presented with a British force that was overextended and whose best formations had been withdrawn for the Greek campaign, was to attack. He attacked before Berlin authorized him to. The advance that followed in March and April of 1941 pushed the British back more than 600 kilometers to the Egyptian border in a matter of weeks and established the pattern that would characterize the Desert War for the next year and a half. Swinging advances and retreats over enormous distances, with neither side able to deliver a knockout blow. The High Command in Berlin was, throughout the Desert Campaign, consistently ambivalent about Rommel in ways that the mythology tends to minimize. Hitler admired him and promoted him. He was promoted to Field Marshal in June of 1942, after the fall of Tobruk, the youngest man to hold that rank in the German army at the time. The German Army High Command, and in particular the Quartermaster General's branch, was consistently frustrated by Rommel's logistics demands and his habit of committing himself to operational objectives that his supply situation couldn't support. The relationship between Rommel and his immediate superior, the Italian Commando Supremo and Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, who commanded all Axis forces in the Mediterranean, was frequently difficult. Rommel believed the Italian command structure was inadequate and said so, in terms that made the management of the alliance more difficult. Some of the supply failures that constrained Rommel's operations were partly a product of this relationship, because Italian goodwill was not infinitely available, and Rommel had not been careful with it. The Second Battle of El Alamein was the turning point in Rommel's African story, and it's worth being precise about what it revealed. Montgomery had more men, more tanks, and more supplies. He had an enemy force that was undermanned relative to the front it was holding, short of fuel, commanded by a general who was physically ill and absent at the opening of the battle. The British intelligence services had broken the German codes and knew Rommel's supply situation in more detail than some of Rommel's own subordinates. Under these conditions, a competent Allied commander would have won the battle. Montgomery was more than competent. He was methodical, he prepared carefully, and he didn't panic when his timetable slipped in the first days. The question historians have debated is not whether Rommel was outmatched at El Alamein. He clearly was. But whether a different German commander in the same circumstances would have prolonged resistance more effectively. Most assessments conclude, not significantly, the material balance was what it was. The retreat from El Alamein to Tunisia, more than 2,000 kilometers in roughly 3 months, is the passage of Rommel's career that the mythology handles least comfortably, because it looks too much like what it was. An army that had lost decisively, running from a pursuer that had the strategic initiative. Rommel conducted a skillful rearguard action, using his experience of desert terrain and his understanding of British tactical patterns to slow the Eighth Army's pursuit, trading space for time. But he was not trying to win anymore. He was trying to preserve what he could. The fights at Mersa Brega, at Burat, at the Mareth Line, these were delaying actions, not counteroffensives. The operational energy that had defined the advance was gone. By the time Rommel left Tunisia for the last time on the 9th of March of 1943, his relationship with the strategic situation had completed its inversion. The man who had attacked on his own initiative before Berlin authorized him to, was now requesting permission from Hitler to evacuate an army that couldn't be saved. Hitler refused, repeatedly. The distance between the commander who seized the initiative in the spring of 1941 and the commander receiving and transmitting directives from a Berlin that refused to acknowledge the situation in 1943 is the measure of how the war had changed. Rommel didn't change it. He was a product of a military culture and a command system that could generate brilliant offensive operational commanders and then deploy them in strategic situations that operational brilliance alone couldn't resolve. The Rommel myth was, and remains, a distortion that serves interests other than historical accuracy. The specific interests it served in the 1950s and 1960s, the rehabilitation of the German officer class, the psychological consolation of British commanders and their institutional histories, the appetite of popular history for a usable hero on the losing side, are not interests that a historian in 2023 needs to continue serving. What we can say, with the documentary evidence available, is this. Rommel was a skilled operational commander of considerable personal courage who consistently overextended his logistics, who was repeatedly bailed out by the failures and hesitations of his opponents, and who was ultimately defeated by a combination of strategic disadvantage and material inferiority that no level of operational skill could have overcome. That is both a significant achievement and a more honest accounting than the mythology allows. One more thing. The question of Rommel's relationship to the Nazi regime and to the crimes of the Second World War is more complicated than both the rehabilitory mythology and its critics allow. There is no documented evidence that Rommel participated in or ordered atrocities. There is documented evidence that he served a regime that was committing them, that he believed in German victory for most of the period when he was winning, and that his disillusionment with Hitler, which was genuine and is documented in correspondence and in the accounts of those around him, came late and was motivated substantially by the recognition that Germany was losing rather than by a principled moral objection to what the regime was doing. His connection to the July 20th plot was genuine but limited in scope. These are the contours of the actual historical figure, and they're more interesting than the myth, if less comfortable. Chapter 12, The World That Watched. Politics, Press, and the Meaning of North Africa. The North African campaign didn't happen in a political vacuum. It was watched in Washington, in London, in Berlin, in Rome, in Moscow, and across the occupied countries of Europe, by audiences who understood that what was happening in the desert carried meaning far beyond the operational outcome of a campaign in a remote corner of the war. In this chapter, I want to step back from the tactical and operational detail and look at the campaign as a political event, at the way it was understood, reported, and used by the governments and peoples who had stakes in its outcome, but weren't fighting in it themselves. In Washington, the North African campaign represented the first sustained engagement of American ground forces against German military power, and its progress was followed with an intensity that reflected both genuine strategic interest and the particular American political anxiety about whether the country's army was ready to fight a first-class enemy. The reporting on Kasserine in February of 1943 was the first moment when the American public received clear, if sometimes incomplete, evidence that the answer to that question was, at least for that moment, no. The press coverage was not entirely free. Military censorship in all the Allied countries shaped what could be reported and how. But enough got through to produce genuine public concern and a congressional debate about the management of the war that the Roosevelt administration had to address carefully. Franklin Roosevelt's own investment in the North African operation was considerable. He had overridden his military advisors, specifically Marshall's preference for a cross-channel invasion, to authorize torch. That made the campaign's success or failure a personal political stake. The Darlan deal, the arrangement with the Vichy admiral that brought French cooperation in exchange for political recognition, was defended by the White House as military necessity, but it produced correspondence from the American press and from Congress that was among the sharpest critical writing about American war policy in the entire conflict. The tension between the ideological framing of the war, a war against fascism, a war for democracy, and the pragmatic arrangements that operational necessity sometimes required, was never more visible than in the autumn and winter of 1942. In London, Churchill's political investment in North Africa was different in character, but equally significant. He had championed the Mediterranean strategy over the American preference for a cross-channel invasion, and the success of Torch and El Alamein was the vindication of that strategic judgment. The fall of Tobruk in June of 1942, which occurred while Churchill was in Washington conferring with Roosevelt, and was handed to him by the president in a piece of paper passed across a desk, an intensely awkward moment that Churchill described in his memoirs, had been a significant political blow domestically. There had been a parliamentary motion of censure, which Churchill survived, but which reflected real disquiet about the management of the war. El Alamein and Torch together reversed that political trajectory. Churchill's famous line about El Alamein, that it was not the end, not even the beginning of the end, but perhaps the end of the beginning, captures in its careful calibration the political as much as the military significance of the moment. Stalin's view of North Africa was, throughout the campaign, one of impatient skepticism. The Soviet Union was absorbing the bulk of German military effort on the Eastern Front. At Stalingrad alone, from November of 1942 to February of 1943, more than 300,000 German Allied soldiers were encircled and destroyed. Soviet casualties in the same period were catastrophic by any measure. From Moscow's perspective, the question of the Second Front, when the Western Allies would land in France and draw German divisions away from the Eastern Front, was not an abstract strategic debate. It was a matter of how many more Soviet soldiers were going to die before the pressure on the Eastern Front was reduced by a significant Allied commitment in the West. North Africa, from this perspective, was not the Second Front. It was as a sideshow that the Western Allies were pursuing, while the Soviet Union did the heavy work. This view was expressed in Stalin's communications with Churchill and Roosevelt, with a directness that diplomatic courtesy barely softened. The historiographical argument about whether it was fair, whether North Africa represented a genuine contribution to the defeat of Germany or a strategic diversion that prolonged the Eastern Front War, continues, and it is not entirely resolved. The occupied populations of Europe watched the North African campaign through the filter of whatever information was available to them. Clandestine radio reception of BBC broadcasts, underground newspapers, the whisper networks of resistance movements. For these audiences, the significance of El Alamein and Torch was primarily symbolic. Evidence that Germany could be defeated, that the Wehrmacht was not invincible, that the Allies were capable of sustained offensive action. The psychological importance of that symbolism in late 1942 and early 1943. 2 full years after the fall of France, in the depths of winter, with the occupied continent still under comprehensive German control, is difficult to quantify, but was recognized by the governments in exile and by the Allied propaganda agencies that were working to sustain resistance morale. The BBC's North Africa coverage was listened to in France, in the Netherlands, in Norway, in Poland, with an attention that the raw operational content didn't fully account for. What people were listening for was evidence of trajectory, not where the battle lines were today, but which direction they were moving. In Germany itself, the public communication of the North African disaster was managed with the tools of a totalitarian information system. Delayed acknowledgement, framing of retreat as strategic repositioning, and eventually a silence that the population was conditioned not to ask questions about. The fall of Tunis on the 7th of May was reported in German media with a lag that reflects the internal argument about how to present it. Goebbels' diaries from this period document the awareness that the propaganda apparatus was managing a narrative that it had diverged significantly from the reality that German families with sons in Africa were beginning to suspect and then to know. Letters home from North Africa had stopped arriving. Red Cross notifications were accumulating. The silence was informative in its own right. The Italian political dimension of the North African campaign is the one that most directly translated into subsequent events, and it deserves careful attention. Italy had been in the war as Germany's ally since June of 1940, and the war had not gone well for the Italian armed forces by any military standard. North Africa was one of several theaters: Greece, the Soviet Union, the Mediterranean, where Italian armies had performed below the expectations of their own government and the patience of their German ally. By the spring of 1943, with Tunisia clearly lost, and the prospect of an Allied invasion of Italian territory now a matter of when rather than whether, the domestic political situation in Italy was under enormous strain. King Victor Emmanuel III and a faction of senior military and government officials were already, in the spring of 1943, exploring the possibility of removing Mussolini and negotiating a separate peace with the Allies. Those conversations are documented in the diaries and memoirs of the participants. The fall of Tunisia on the 13th of May of 1943 accelerated that internal Italian political process. Mussolini's fall on the 25th of July of 1943, less than 10 weeks after the end of the Tunisian campaign, was not a coincidence. It was the political consequence of a military defeat whose implications could no longer be contained by the Italian state's capacity for denial. The press coverage of the North African campaign, particularly the American press, which had correspondence with the forces from the earliest weeks of Torch, produced writing that is, in historical retrospect, among the more important documentary records of the campaign. Ernie Pyle, the American war correspondent, whose columns were syndicated to hundreds of American newspapers, was in North Africa throughout the campaign, and his reporting, grounded in the experience of ordinary soldiers rather than in command decisions and operational plans, reached an American readership that had little other access to what the war actually felt like at the individual level. His columns from the Kasserine period and from the final weeks in Tunisia are, in their texture and their honesty, documents that the official histories can't replicate. They are also, I should note, subject to the same military censorship constraints that shaped all reporting from the theatre. What Pyle wrote was what the censors allowed him to write, and some of what he observed didn't make it to print. The question of how the North African campaign would be remembered was, in a sense, already being debated before the fighting was over. The official histories, British, American, German, Italian, that would be written in the following decades were going to be shaped by the institutional interests of the services and governments producing them, as official histories always are. The American history would emphasize the growth of American military capability from Kasserine to Bizerte, a narrative of institutional learning and eventual triumph. The British history would emphasize the Eighth Army's desert experience and El Alameин's centrality. The German history would engage, as post-war German military history tended to, with the question of individual commander brilliance versus strategic disadvantage. The Italian history would work to recover the honor of formations that had been undervalued during the campaign and dismissed after it. All of these framings capture something true. None of them captures everything. The actual campaign, in its full complexity, sits in the gap between all of them. Chapter 13. What the armies learned, doctrine, reform, and the transformation of the Allied military machine. There is a particular kind of institutional knowledge that only gets built the hard way, through failure, through the careful examination of that failure, and through the willingness to change structures and doctrines that an institution has sometimes been defending for years. The Allied armies that emerged from the North African campaign in May of 1943 were not the same armies that had landed at Casablanca and Algiers 6 months earlier. They were different in ways that went deeper than experience, deeper than the accumulated tactical lessons of individual engagements. They had been reformed, and the reforms that were driven by the North African experience, in command structure, in combined arms doctrine, in logistics organization, in the relationship between air power and ground forces, shaped the Allied military machine for the rest of the war in ways that are directly traceable in the operational records of every subsequent campaign. The most immediately visible reform was in the American Army's command and staff culture. The Kasserine disaster had exposed a specific failure, the gap between the way American doctrine described combined arms warfare and the way American units actually practiced it in the field. The formal doctrine, the pre-war manuals, the training center syllabuses correctly identified the need to integrate tanks, infantry, artillery, and anti-tank weapons into a coordinated tactical system. What the training system hadn't adequately replicated was the speed, the noise, the confusion, and the enemy initiative that characterized actual combat against a veteran German force. Units that had performed adequately against simulated opponents in the Louisiana and Carolinas maneuvers of 1941 found that the simulation hadn't prepared them for the thing itself. The solution wasn't to write better manuals. The solution was to build a training system that was harder, more realistic, and more insistent on the specific combined arms coordination that combat required. General Leslie McNair, commanding Army Ground Forces in the United States, drove those reforms through the training establishment with considerable energy in the months following Kasserine. The artillery arm deserves specific attention in any discussion of what worked and what was reformed. American field artillery in North Africa was, from the earliest engagements, one of the most consistently effective combat arms in the Second Corps. The fire direction center system, which centralized the control of multiple artillery battalions under a single fire direction network, allowing massed fires to be called on a single target quickly, was American in origin and proved devastating when properly employed. At El Guitar in March of 1943, the concentrated fires of Second Corps artillery against the attacking 10th Panzer Division's armored thrust were sufficiently effective to constitute a genuine tactical defeat of a German armored force, something that hadn't happened to the Afrika Korps under those circumstances before. The lesson reinforced in Tunisia was that American artillery, properly commanded and supported by adequate communications, was a decisive arm. The subsequent investment in artillery coordination, in fire direction technology, and in the forward observer system that linked infantry companies directly to fire support was partly a product of the North African validation of what that arm could do. The reorganization of armored divisions that followed the North African experience was perhaps the most significant doctrinal change in the American ground forces during the entire war. The armored division as it existed at the start of the Torch period was organized with an excessive proportion of tanks relative to infantry and engineers, a reflection of the pre-war doctrine that armor was primarily an exploitation force that broke through and drove into the enemy rear. Tunisia demonstrated clearly that armored divisions operating without adequate integral infantry support were vulnerable in close terrain, in defended positions, and in the kind of sustained attrition that characterized the Tunisian hill fighting. The reorganization approved in September of 1943 reduced the number of tank battalions in an armored division from 6 to 3 and increased the infantry component proportionally. This was a direct doctrinal response to what the campaign had shown. The armored divisions that fought in France in 1944 were better balanced instruments than those that fought in Tunisia, partly because Tunisia had demonstrated where the imbalance lay. The British Army's institutional learning from North Africa operated at a somewhat different level, because the Eighth Army had been in continuous operation since 1940 and had already developed significant tactical experience. What the North African campaign reinforced for the British was the importance of set-piece battle preparation. The systematic, deliberate, methodically planned assault that Montgomery had practiced at El Alamein and which had worked. The question that occupied British military thinkers in the months after Tunisia was whether this approach was applicable in the more complex terrain of northwestern Europe, where the sweep of the desert was replaced by hedgerows, rivers, and urban areas that compressed the battlefield and reduced the value of the artillery preparation on which Montgomery's method relied. The answer, worked out painfully in Normandy and after, was that the method needed adaptation rather than wholesale replacement. But that was a lesson Tunisia had not yet provided. The reforms in the relationship between ground and air forces, which I touched on in the air chapter, had doctrinal consequences that extended well beyond the tactical level. The principle established in Northwest Africa that air power should be controlled by air commanders applying a priority framework rather than parceled out to ground commanders as an organic support asset became the foundation of Allied joint doctrine for the remainder of the war and, in a modified form, for decades afterward. The argument wasn't settled without resistance. There were American ground commanders who wanted air assets assigned to their specific formations and who remained skeptical of centralized air control throughout the war. But the operational evidence from Tunisia was sufficiently clear that the doctrinal framework held, and the subsequent campaigns consistently validated its logic. The air-ground team that developed in Northwest Africa, the forward air controller system, the contact car, the direct communication between flying squadron commanders and ground formation commanders, was a genuine operational innovation that the Allies employed and the Axis could not match. Intelligence had a particularly interesting and somewhat uncomfortable learning curve in the North African campaign. The Allied signals intelligence advantage, the ability to read a significant portion of Axis communications through the Ultra program at Bletchley Park, was real and consequential throughout the campaign. But Ultra was a tool, not a guarantee. The intelligence product from Bletchley had to be interpreted, disseminated to commanders who could use it without revealing its source, and acted upon. And all three of those processes could and did fail at various points in the campaign. The failure to cut off the German supply route to Tunisia in November of 1942 was partly an intelligence failure of application. The fact of the German buildup was available through signals intelligence, but the response to it was too slow. Kasserine was partly an intelligence failure of interpretation. The indicators of the German offensive buildup were available, but weren't assembled into an adequate warning picture in time. The response to both failures was structural. Improvements in the intelligence liaison system between Bletchley and theatre headquarters. Better training for intelligence officers in the identification of offensive build-up indicators, and clearer protocols for the dissemination of warnings to tactical commanders. These structural improvements were in place by the Spring Offensive and are part of the explanation for the Allies' better prepared response to German actions in April and May. The logistics reforms driven by the North African campaign were less glamorous than the doctrinal and organizational changes in combat arms, but they were at least equally important. The American Army in 1942 had not developed, in its training and organizational planning, an adequate institutional appreciation of the logistical demands of sustained mechanized operations in difficult terrain. The experience of feeding, fueling, and supplying the Second Corps through the Tunisian winter, the road convoys in the mud, the port throughput calculations, the fuel truck shortfalls that left tanks immobilized at critical moments, generated an enormous institutional learning process that ran through the supply corps, the engineer corps, and the transportation corps simultaneously. The officers who managed logistics in Northwest Africa in 1942 and 43 went on to plan logistics for Sicily, for Italy, for Overlord. The Red Ball Express that sustained Patton's Third Army across France in the summer of 1944 was built on organizational templates and personal experience accumulated in the dust and mud of Tunisia. The combined arms training reforms that flowed from the North African experience were institutionalized at Fort Knox, Fort Benning, and the infantry school at various points during 1943 and 44. The specific lessons were documented in after-action reports and in what the Army called lessons learned publications that were circulated through the training establishment. Reading those publications now, the ones that have been declassified and are available in the US Army Heritage and Education Center, is a fascinating exercise because you can trace the direct connection between a specific failure in Tunisia and a specific change in training doctrine in the United States. A lesson about the coordination of tank destroyers and infantry in the defense against armored assault at Kasserine becomes a new training exercise requirement at an armored school 18 months later. The documentation of institutional learning is unusually complete for this period, and it tells a story about the professionalism of the reform process that the operational histories sometimes overlook. I want to close this chapter by making an argument about what the North African campaign represented in the longer arc of the Allied war effort, because I think it's sometimes undervalued. The American army that landed in North Africa in November of 1942 was not ready to fight Germany. Not in the sense of being capable of delivering the cross-channel invasion that Marshall had been advocating. The British position that a premature landing in France would have been catastrophic was, by any fair assessment of the American forces' actual capability at that moment, correct. North Africa provided something that training camps in the United States couldn't provide: the actual experience of combined arms warfare against a first-class opponent at operational scale over a sustained period. The cost of that education was significant. In lives, in material, in the months it added to the timeline of the European war. The gain was an army that, by the time it landed in France in the summer of 1944, had been educated by Sicily, Italy, and Tunisia into something Germany couldn't have handled in 1942. The strategic argument about whether the price was right, whether the same objective could have been achieved more cheaply, is genuinely unresolved. But the transformation itself is not in doubt. Chapter 14, The Road to Sicily. How North Africa built the next campaign. On the 10th of July, 1943. Less than 2 months after the last Axis soldier in Tunisia put down his weapon, the largest amphibious operation the world had seen to that point in the Second World War came ashore on the beaches of southeastern Sicily. Operation Husky, the Allied invasion of the first piece of Axis-held European soil, deployed more than 150,000 troops in the initial assault wave, carried by more than 3,000 ships and landing craft, supported by 4,000 aircraft. The planning for Husky had been running in parallel with the final phases of the Tunisian campaign, and the relationship between the two operations was not merely sequential but generative. The experience, the doctrine, the logistical networks, and in many cases, the specific formations that fought in Tunisia were the raw material from which the Sicilian invasion was built. Understanding North Africa is understanding Husky, whether the operational histories present it that way or not. The planning for a follow-on operation after the clearance of North Africa had been authorized at the Casablanca Conference in January of 1943. When Roosevelt and Churchill met in the Moroccan city, they'd deliberated 2 months earlier and agreed on what they called the next steps in the Mediterranean. The American military preference, led again by Marshall, was for a rapid shift to a cross-channel operation following the victory in Tunisia, using the momentum, the shipping, and the trained formations to deliver the blow against France that the Americans had been arguing for since 1942. Churchill and the British chiefs preferred continued pressure in the Mediterranean. Sicily first, then potentially mainland Italy, exploiting the strategic advantages of position and the momentum of the African victory. The compromise, again, favoured the British preference. Sicily was authorised, with the understanding that the subsequent campaign would be decided in light of the Sicilian outcome. This decision was made in Casablanca in January. The Tunisian campaign didn't end until May. The overlap in planning, preparing for Sicily while still fighting in Tunisia, created organizational stress at Eisenhower's headquarters that is documented in the operational records of the period. The command structure for Husky was the direct inheritance of the command structure developed in North Africa. Eisenhower remained supreme commander. Alexander remained ground forces commander, now redesignated as the 15th Army Group for the Sicilian operation, commanding Montgomery's 8th Army and Patton's newly formed 7th Army. The first time an American Army headquarters had been committed to an operation in this war. The Air Command under Tedder, the Naval Command under Admiral Andrew Cunningham. All were the same officers, the same commands, the same interallied relationships that had been developed, tested, and argued out over the preceding months. This continuity of command was operationally valuable in ways that weren't universally appreciated at the time, but become visible in retrospect. Eisenhower didn't have to introduce his component commanders to each other. In July of 1943, he'd already been managing their relationships for the better part of a year. The logistical infrastructure built in North Africa was the physical foundation of the Sicilian operation. The ports of Algiers, Beaune, Bizerte, and Tunis, the last two captured in May, were the primary staging bases for the Husky convoys. The roads and rail lines that had been improved by Allied engineers throughout the Tunisian campaign were now carrying the supplies, ammunition, and equipment being loaded onto the ships for Sicily. The truck and transport companies that had operated the supply chain from the Algerian coast to the Tunisian front were now working the same routes in reverse, moving materiel from inland depots to the coastal ports. The American and British supply organizations that had learned expensively how to manage a long and difficult logistics chain through the North African winter were now applying that knowledge to a shorter and somewhat less punishing problem. The logistical preparation for Husky was considerably more professional than the preparation for Torch had been, and the North African experience is the primary reason. The landing craft situation, the specific technical constraint that shaped Allied amphibious strategy throughout the Mediterranean and eventually across the English Channel, was addressed, though not fully resolved, through the North African experience. The shortage of landing ship tanks the large ocean-going vessels capable of driving directly onto a beach and unloading vehicles and heavy equipment, was a constant constraint on Allied amphibious planning from Torch onward. The number of LSTs available for Husky was still below what the planners would have wanted. The management of those LSTs, their turnaround time, their maintenance schedules, their allocation between the competing demands of the Mediterranean and the Pacific, was a planning problem that consumed significant staff time in the months between Tunisia and Sicily. The practical experience gained in the Torch landings, including the surf conditions at Moroccan beaches and the harbour seizure problems at Oran, shaped the beach selection process for Sicily and the revised planning for what a naval support force could and couldn't do in support of the initial assault. Patton's role in the transition from Tunisia to Sicily is one of the more interesting organizational stories of the period. He'd commanded the Second Corps for roughly 6 weeks in Tunisia before returning to planning duties, and the Second Corps command had passed to Bradley. In the planning for Husky, Patton was given command of the American 7th Army, which would land on the southern coast of Sicily, while Montgomery's 8th Army landed on the southeastern coast. The 7th Army's role in Alexander's original plan was primarily to protect the left flank of the 8th Army's drive north toward Messina, a supporting role that subordinated the Americans to the British effort. Patton's response to that allocation of roles and his subsequent conduct in Sicily is well documented and involves a combination of genuine operational initiative and personal and institutional ego that had been building since the tensions of the Tunisian command period. The argument between Patton and the Husky command structure about the 7th Army's role began in the planning phase and continued through the campaign. It's a thread that starts in North Africa and runs all the way to the arguments about command in Northwest Europe in 1944. The intelligence preparation for Husky included one of the most celebrated deception operations of the entire war. Operation Mincemeat, the planting of false documents on a corpse dressed as a British officer and floated ashore in Spain, intended to convince German intelligence that the Allied follow-on operation after Tunisia was aimed at Greece and Sardinia rather than Sicily. The operation worked to a significant degree. German intelligence assessments in the spring of 1943 reflected genuine uncertainty about the intended Allied objective, and Hitler moved German formations toward Greece that might otherwise have reinforced Sicily. The operation has been extensively documented and is not in dispute in its broad outlines. What the operational historians sometimes underemphasize is that mincemeat worked within a broader strategic context in which the Allies already had significant intelligence advantage through Ultra, and in which German intelligence in the Mediterranean had been consistently struggling to correctly assess Allied intentions since the beginning of Torch. Mincemeat was the most elegant element of a deception campaign that had a more extended foundation. The formations that carried the lessons of North Africa into Sicily were, for the most part, the same formations that had fought in Tunisia. The British 1st and 8th Army Divisions, the American 1st and 45th Infantry Divisions, the 1st Armoured Division, the British 7th Armoured Division. These were units with North African experience at every level, from the divisional commanders who'd argued about command in the Tunisian hills, to the infantry platoons that had learned, at cost, how to clear a German machine gun position without being destroyed by the covering fire. That accumulated experience, unquantifiable in any precise way but real and consequential, showed in Sicily in the speed of tactical decision-making, in the quality of fire discipline, in the willingness of small unit leaders to act on their own initiative within a commander's intent. rather than waiting for explicit orders. These are the downstream effects of combat experience, and they're part of what made the Sicilian campaign, despite its significant frictions, considerably more fluent than the Tunisian opening had been. The relationship between the North African campaign and the subsequent decision to invade mainland Italy is the largest strategic question in the Mediterranean theatre. And I want to address it briefly here because the argument has direct bearing on the assessment of the North African campaign's strategic value. The decision to continue operations into Italy, following the Sicilian success, was made at the Quadrant Conference in Quebec in August of 1943, after Sicily had been secured, but before the autumn Italian campaign had begun. The American military chiefs remained skeptical of the Italian option, arguing that it would consume resources needed for the cross-channel operation. Churchill and the British chiefs argued that the collapse of the Italian government following Mussolini's fall, itself a consequence of the military pressure that Tunisia and Sicily had generated, created an opportunity that ought to be seized. The decision, once again, went to the British preference. The Italian campaign that followed, long, expensive, and strategically contested in its value, is the most debated legacy of the Mediterranean strategy. Its origins lie in the momentum that the North African campaign created, and the argument about whether that momentum was wisely exploited is one that strategic historians continue to engage. I want to end this chapter with a direct statement about what the North African campaign contributed to Operation Overlord, the cross-channel invasion of Normandy in June of 1944, because the connection is sometimes presented as indirect when it was, in important respects, quite direct. The amphibious doctrine used at Normandy was developed in large part from the experience of Torch and the subsequent Mediterranean landings. The air-ground coordination system used in Normandy was the system developed in Northwest Africa and refined in Sicily and Italy. The command relationships between Eisenhower, his army group commanders, and his component commanders, the architecture of the Allied military organization that fought the Northwest Europe campaign, were built on the architecture first assembled for Torch. Many of the formation commanders at Normandy had commanded formations in Tunisia. The lessons of Kasserine were in the training syllabuses of the units that landed at Omaha Beach. North Africa was not a detour from the main effort. It was the school that made the main effort possible. Chapter 15, The Desert One Last Time, Memory, Graves, and What It All finally meant I've been working toward this chapter for the better part of this entire documentary, and I find, now that I'm here, that it's the one I'm least certain how to write. The operational history is finished. The analysis is done. The doctrinal arguments and the command controversies and the logistical calculations have all been laid out. What remains is the oldest and the hardest question that any historian of any war eventually has to sit with. What did it mean? Not what did it achieve? That's a question that has answers documented and debatable. But what did it mean for the men who were there? And for the generations that came after them? And for our understanding of what human beings do to each other and to themselves when institutions and ideologies set them in motion against each other across a patch of ground neither side chose and neither side had particular reason to love. The cemeteries of North Africa are among the most quietly affecting places I know from the documentary record and from the accounts of those who visited them. The Commonwealth War Graves Commission maintains several major cemeteries in North Africa, including the El Alamein War Cemetery in Egypt, where more than 7,000 Commonwealth soldiers are buried, and the Enfidaville War Cemetery in Tunisia, and the Medjez El Bab War Cemetery, where nearly 2,900 soldiers of the 1st and 8th Armies lie under the stone markers that the Commission places with its characteristic combination of precision and restraint. The American cemetery at Carthage, outside Tunis, contains almost 3,000 American soldiers, the permanent garrison of those who crossed an ocean and didn't come home. The German military cemetery at Tobruk holds more than 6,000 German and Italian soldiers. These numbers are not exhaustive of the total dead. They are the known dead, the identified dead, the dead who had graves to go to, the total killed in the North African campaign across all nationalities and all phases of the fighting. From the Italian invasion of Egypt in September of 1940 to the Tunisian surrender in May of 1943 is estimated in the published histories at somewhere between 150,000 and 300,000, depending on what is counted and how. The range itself tells you something about the limits of the accounting. The men buried in those cemeteries were not, in the majority, professional soldiers who had chosen a military life. They were farmers from Yorkshire, and accountants from New Jersey, and students from Cape Town, and factory workers from Adelaide. They were Algerians who had been subjects of the French colonial administration, and Gurkhas from the hill districts of Nepal, and Sikhs from the Punjab, and members of the Royal Natal Carabineers, and the Maori Battalion of the 2nd New Zealand Expeditionary Force. They were Italian conscripts from Calabria and Messina, who had crossed the Mediterranean on transport ships that they knew were being hunted because there was a war and they were in it. They were young German officers who had volunteered for service in the Afrika Korps because it was the exciting command in 1941, and who found, in the mountains above Tunis in the spring of 1943, that the excitement had entirely run out. All of them were somebody's son. Some of them were somebody's father. The military bureaucracy of all the armies in this campaign did its best to record who they were and where they fell. The record is incomplete. It always is. I want to spend a moment on the Tunisian civilians, who are perhaps the least visible presence in the entire historiography of this campaign. Tunisia in 1942 and 1943 was a French protectorate with a substantial indigenous Tunisian population and a significant European settler community. The 6 months of combat on Tunisian soil were not a war conducted in empty space. The minefields were laid in farmland. The artillery barrages fell on hills where shepherd communities had their seasonal roots. The advancing and retreating armies commandeered food, transport, and labor from villages along their lines of march. The accounts that exist in the French colonial archives and in the records of the French civil administration in Tunisia from this period document the disruption and loss suffered by the Tunisian civilian population. Property destroyed, livestock taken, fields mined, family members killed by ordnance that fell indiscriminately. These were not war crimes in the formal sense. They were the ordinary violence that warfare visits on civilian populations who happen to occupy contested ground. The Tunisian experience of the campaign as a subject of that violence, rather than a participant in its direction, is a dimension of the history that the operational accounts are structurally unable to see, and that the subsequent historiography has not adequately recovered. The Jewish community in Tunisia had a particular and terrible experience of the period that the campaign's history must acknowledge. When German forces arrived in Tunisia in November of 1942 as part of the Axis build-up, they brought with them the apparatus of anti-Jewish persecution that had been applied throughout occupied Europe. The Jewish community in Tunisia, numbering roughly 100,000 people, was subjected to forced labor, property confiscation, the imposition of the Yellow Star, and the beginnings of deportation planning. The German occupation of Tunisia lasted approximately 6 months, and the speed of the Allied advance in the spring of 1943 meant that the deportation program was not fully implemented. The Tunisian Jewish community survived the occupation, but not without significant suffering and loss. This is a dimension of the North African campaign that sits outside the operational history, but is part of the complete moral accounting of what this period meant for the people who lived in the theatre where the armies fought. The veterans of the North African campaign, the men who came home from Tunisia in the summer and autumn of 1943, many to be processed and trained and committed to the next operation, others to hospitals and recovery, others to administrative roles that their combat experiences qualified them for, carried the campaign with them in ways that the institutional literature documents only at the edges. The American veterans of the 1st Infantry Division, the Big Red One, which had fought from the Torch landings through to Tunisia and would go on to Omaha Beach, were sometimes described in the accounts of officers who commanded them in 1944 as qualitatively different from the replacement soldiers who arrived with less experience, more careful in their tactical choices, less wasteful of life, more likely to use ground and fire and cover rather than movement and courage alone. That difference was the deposit of North Africa in their professional formation. It was also sometimes the deposit of a war wariness that the institutional structures didn't always know how to handle. The British veterans of the 8th Army had a particular, and in some more complex homecoming relationship with their war. The Desert War had given them an identity, the Africa Star Campaign Medal, the 8th Army Formation Sign, the informal culture of the desert veterans that was strong and in some cases exclusive in ways that created tension when they were integrated into formations that hadn't shared the experience. Montgomery's 8th Army formations that fought in Italy from the autumn of 1943 onward carried the desert identity into a different kind of campaign and found, not always comfortably, that the open ground and long horizons of the Western desert didn't translate to the mountains and river valleys of the Italian peninsula. The adaptation required was real, and the cost of learning it was, again, paid in lives. The German prisoners of war, more than 100,000 of the approximately 230,000 Axis soldiers taken in Tunisia were German, with the remainder Italian, were processed initially through Algerian and Moroccan camps before many were transported to prisoner of war facilities in the United States and the United Kingdom. The experience of German POWs in American camps is documented in both American military records and in the memoirs of those who survived and wrote about it. The general treatment was adequate by the standards of the Geneva Convention. The psychological adjustment required, from membership of an army that had believed itself invincible to prisoner status in a country that was outproducing Germany in every material category, was significant and is reflected in the memoir literature. Some German prisoners in American camps encountered, for the first time, the scale of American industrial and agricultural production in a way that made the prospect of German victory seem, in retrospect, implausible in a way that it hadn't while they were fighting. The strategic legacy of the North African campaign is, in the long academic argument, still being actively assessed. The Mediterranean strategy that the campaign represented, the decision to fight through North Africa, Sicily, and Italy before committing to the cross-channel invasion, delayed Overlord from its earliest possible date of 1943 to its actual date of June of 1944. Whether that delay was strategically costly, whether an earlier cross-channel invasion would have ended the war sooner, reached Berlin before the Soviet army, saved the populations of Eastern Europe from a Soviet occupation that replaced a German one, is a counterfactual argument that can't be resolved with certainty, because counterfactual history doesn't have documents. What can be said is that the cross-channel invasion that did happen in June of 1944 succeeded comprehensively, and that the Allied armies that executed it were operationally mature in ways that the armies of 1942 were not, and that the North African campaign was a significant part of the process that produced that maturity. Whether a less mature Allied army could have succeeded in an earlier overlord is unknown and unknowable. The question deserves honesty about its own limits. The physical landscape of the North African campaign is still present in the forms that battlefields take decades after the fighting ends. The minefields laid in the Western Desert and in Tunisia. Surveys conducted by the Tunisian and Egyptian governments in subsequent decades found that agricultural land in both countries was still contaminated by unexploded ordnance long after the campaign ended. Farmers in the areas of the Kasserine Pass and the Marath Line and the El Alamein position encountered that contamination in their fields for years after the war, with injuries and deaths documented in the records of the relevant civil administrations. The battle had deposited its physical residue in the ground, and the ground held it for a generation. This is the unglamorous afterlife of military campaigns. The ongoing cost paid not by the armies that fought, but by the communities that inherited the terrain. I've spent a long time with this campaign, longer in terms of primary source reading and secondary source argument, than I've spent with almost any other single theatre of the Second World War. And the thing that stays with me, that I keep coming back to when I try to account for why it matters beyond its strategic consequences, is the sheer ordinariness of the people in it. The planning documents and the command decisions and the operational orders are necessary to understand what happened, but they don't explain why men got out of landing craft in the Moroccan surf at 3 a.m, or why sappers cleared mines by hand in the dark under fire, or why a tank crew stayed in a burning vehicle longer than survival required, because the man in the seat beside them hadn't gotten out yet. Those aren't explained by doctrine or strategy or national policy. They're explained by something older and smaller and less reducible. The relationship between individual human beings under extreme pressure, and what those relationships produced in terms of action and endurance and occasional courage that the participants, in many cases, could never fully explain afterward. The North African campaign began with a political argument about where to strike Germany, and it ended with 230,000 prisoners sitting in the Tunisian dust. In between, it contained 6 months of fighting in terrain and conditions that were unlike any previous experience for most of the men who fought in it, against an opponent who was skilled and determined and ultimately outmatched by forces that were larger, better supplied, and continuously improving. It contained doctrinal failures and command failures and logistical failures and moments of genuine operational brilliance on multiple sides. It contained the first serious American engagement with the German army and the education that engagement provided. It contained the last campaign of a general whose reputation was partly mythological, even while he was making it. It contained the political consequences that brought down a government and changed the direction of the Italian War, and the operational consequences that shaped the Normandy landing 2 years later. All of that is in the record. I hope, in these 15 chapters, I've done justice to some part of it. The desert doesn't remember any of this. The sand moves over the positions and the vehicle tracks and the shell craters, and in a few decades, there is nothing visible. The landscape absorbs the history and goes on being what it was before anyone with a flag planted it and called it a front line. But the record holds what the land has covered, and as long as we read it honestly, with the attention it deserves and the humility it requires, the campaign doesn't entirely belong to the past. It belongs to anyone willing to sit still long enough to listen. Good night.